The old man chuckled and looked at his subordinates, who were packing things up in a hurry. After a while, he sighed.
Whether nightmare gates are produced by the spell or not, there's definitely a connection between the two, or rather, the three, since awakened are also part of this equation.
He grew silent after that, and then added in a more serious tone.
What interests me the most, however, is which of the three came first.
Sunny looked at him with surprise.
Forgive me, Professor, but isn't that common knowledge? The spell came first, bringing with it the nightmares, then we awakened appeared as the result.
He frowned slightly.
Of course, common knowledge isn't always trustworthy, but in this case it seems to follow logic.
Professor Obel shook his head.
Who can really say? The beginnings of the spell aren't documented well. Back then, the world wasn't in the best shape, and by the time we knew that something was happening, it was already out of our ability to prevent, contain, or control. We tried, of course, but even then, some truths never get to become widely known or even be put on paper at all. It's very likely that what you said is true. There are other possibilities, though. Ones that would demand entirely different solutions.
Sunny looked at him with a perplexed expression. Sunny asked, "What do you mean?" The elderly scientist hesitated.
Have you ever asked yourself this? Did the spell bring nightmares with it, or did the nightmares bring the spell? Forgive me, this is still too broad. Here's another question. Do the nightmares produce the awakened, or do the awakened produce the nightmares?
Sunny blinked. Sunny asked, "What?" The old man smiled.
Consider it a mental exercise, of course. It's widely known that one becomes an awakened through surviving the first nightmare. However, after that, things become more interesting. You are too young to remember, but at the beginning of it all, the disasters of the spell descended on the waking world in stages. Otherwise, we would have never survived.
Professor Obel's eyes suddenly became distant, as if he was remembering a distant past.
At first, there were only those infected by the spell. Some of them became sleepers, and some became dormant abominations. Then, after the first solstice, they were awakened. However, there were also nightmare gates of the second category, and with them, more powerful creatures came into our world. Eventually, there were more sleepers, more awakened. There were also masters, but with them came more gates, and more gates that were unlike anything we had ever seen.
He paused.
Then there were saints in North America, and now we have the chain of nightmares. One can't help but wonder.
Sunny didn't like the sound of that. Sunny muttered, "What's he trying to say?" The fragile old man let out a heavy sigh. Sunny ventured, "Wonder about what?"
This is just a scientific inquiry, Master Sunless. Don't take it close to heart. As scientists, our duty is to ask questions, and one of these questions is whether there's a correlation between the number and power of awakened in our world and the number and power of the nightmare gates that manifest here, awakened and nightmares. Which of these elements is the cause and which is the effect?
Sunny thought for a bit, then simply shook his head.
Your argument has a big flaw, Professor. If there really was a correlation and we, awakened, were somehow responsible for attracting bigger and better nightmare gates, then there wouldn't have been a Category 5 gate in North America before a bunch of Supremes ran around the world. I think you are just giving in to the desire to see patterns in the chaos that all us, humans, share.
There were 3 sovereigns alive in the world right now, but there hadn't been any when that gate swallowed an entire continent. In any case, Sunny wasn't going to mention the Supremes as anything but a theoretical possibility. Professor Obel nodded with appreciation.
Good thinking, young man. It's always good to have a healthy amount of skepticism. However, your point is only unassailable if we assume a crucial detail to be true.
Sunny frowned. Sunny pressed, "Yes, what detail?" The old man looked at the scientists surrounding them and smiled with a bit of sadness.
That the impact of a powerful awakened emerging only flows down the river of time as we, mortals, do. However, if it spreads like a ripple through time, just like the aftershock of a gate manifesting itself into reality, then it doesn't matter when their ascension happens. The first supreme might appear in a few years, but the consequences of their rise could have already burdened us years ago.
His fatigued eyes suddenly shone with strange light.
As for the harrowing gate that destroyed North America, who knows? Maybe it's just an echo of a god emerging from the human race in a distant, dire future.
Some time later, Sunny left his shadow in the laboratory to stand watch and went to check on his soldiers. As he walked through the underground complex, his expression was dark. What Professor Obel had told him, Sunny wasn't exactly buying it, at least not entirely. However, he felt that there were a few nuggets of truth in what the old man believed, even if the scientists might have come to the wrong conclusions based on those theories. The ripples of time. The disasters that came from the future and thus paved the path for their eventual inception, thus creating a weird self-contained paradox. Sunny was dubious about the validity and even sanity of these ideas. In his experience, the simplest answer was most often correct. Professor Obel seemed to have lost sight of that fact. There was one theory, however, that made him restless.
Can the ascension of many awakened really cause the growing number and intensity of the nightmare gates?
He didn't really see how that could be the case. After all, one had to go through a nightmare first to become awakened, not the other way around. However, if he assumed that there really was a correlation, one thing would make more sense. Walking through the dark corridors, Sunny scowled.
Can this be the reason why the sovereigns are suppressing the emergence of new saints? No, more than that, can this be the reason why none of them challenged the fifth nightmare yet?
In the past, he had thought that all of this hidden oppression was just the result of the ambition and lust for power consuming Asterion, Anvil of Valor and Kai Song, but was that the only reason? Sunny let out a frustrated sigh. He simply didn't know. Outside, the blizzard was still rampaging across the world, drowning reality in a murky white haze. It was hard for a master like Sunny to get cold, but even still, he shivered and hurried to get back inside. Entering the building that housed the sleeping pods of the cohort members, he nodded at Verne, who was already waiting there with a somber face. By now, around 8 hours had passed since their arrival. The people Sunny had sent into the dream realm would be returning any minute now. The steady master looked at him and asked,
"How did your mating with the professor go?"
Sunny shrugged.
We had an interesting talk. He's an outstanding person.
It was strange, really. Professor Obel was a mundane human, but he had probably saved more lives than any awakened Sunny knew of. Without the predictive system the old man had developed, countless people would have been swallowed by the emerging gates over the decades. Sunny knew how dangerous a sudden manifestation of a gate in a populous area could be. He had faced one himself. After all, Verne silently nodded.
I hope you understand now why it's so important to deliver him and his scientists to safety. Master Sunless, their work must continue.
Sunny wanted to answer, but at that moment, the sleeping pods came to life, announcing that the people occupying them were waking up. Samara, Kim, and Luster returned almost at the same time. They climbed out of the pods and put on their clothes with dark expressions on their faces.
I guess the news isn't too good.
At that moment, Luster blurted, "Captain, sir, bad, it's really bad." Sunny looked at him darkly. Sunny said, "I gathered as much, speak." The three awakened looked at each other. Eventually, it was Kim who addressed the masters.
The situation is still unclear, but there was some sort of earthquake, followed by the manifestation of multiple Category 3 gates. There were also several titans that emerged. The three saints fought one of them above the strait between West Antarctica and the center. And then, communications across all the southern quadrant went down. By the time we left the Citadel, people were still trying to understand what happened.
Sunny's face darkened. All of that sounded very troublesome. It seemed that the chain of nightmares had reached a qualitative change, plunging Antarctica in chaos.
What about our orders? Have you heard from Colonel Jet?
Samara spoke in a subdued tone. She did pass on instructions, sir. Judging by the heavy gazes of his subordinates, however, he wouldn't like what they were about to say. Samara conceded. Well, at least something went well. Master Verne frowned as he looked at the beautiful sharpshooter.
Well, and what does Army Command want us to do?
Samara sighed.
The region between this installation and the nearest siege capital is judged to be too dangerous to traverse. All the Antarctic center is affected, but its southern edge was seemingly hit the worst, so we can't go back. The previous evacuation plan was scrapped.
Verne didn't say anything, but his jaw muscles tightened. It looked as if he was on the verge of uttering a curse, which said a lot about how dissatisfied the man was with the news from what Sunny had observed. Verne was a very uptight and proper person. He himself was far from feeling elated. As well, being stuck in a remote facility with no route of escape wasn't as bad as it could get, but very close to it. Sunny cursed for the both of them.
So what? Are we supposed to just stay here and wait for death?
Samara shook her head.
We received new orders, sir, although evacuation by land seems to be impossible at the moment. The naval convoy that delivered us to Antarctica is already on the way back to pick up the second batch of refugees. One of the vessels, battleship Ariadne, is going to be rerouted to the southern edge of the Antarctic center. If all goes well, it'll reach us in 2 to 3 weeks. We are ordered to fortify Low 49's defenses and await its arrival.
Verne let out a relieved sigh.
I see 3 weeks, and that should be doable.
Sunny, however, wasn't too enthused. The thought of going back aboard a ship didn't sound very alluring. On the other hand, traversing hundreds of kilometers of rugged terrain with 2,000 local soldiers and civilians, as well as no reconnaissance data from Army Command and an unknown number of Titans walking around, seemed like an even worse idea. He shrugged with a grin.
I see. Well, I guess we got ourselves a small vacation.
Considering that the cohort was going to spend at least 2 weeks at the research facility, Sunny told his soldiers to make themselves at home. The Rhino was brought within the walls of the fortress, and they chose to use it as their living quarters instead of settling in one of the buildings. The new environment, really, was a welcome change. The cohort was exhausted after a month of constant fighting, and this forced break, although unexpected, could potentially give them ample time to rest and recuperate. If something didn't go really wrong, of course. Low 49 was a large facility and offered the members of the cohort a lot of opportunities to entertain themselves and pass time. They could eat in the mess hall, relax in one of the recreational lounges, or even visit a small library. The most refreshing change, however, was simply being among new people. Conversing with the civilian staff of the installation reminded them of the calm times before the chain of nightmares. There were just 2 places that Sunny forbade his soldiers from approaching: the old observatory and the outer wall that oversaw the ocean. Even though the observatory had its telescope dismantled, he still didn't like it. The ocean. Meanwhile, Sunny was just prejudiced against dark water, for a good reason. A few days passed in relative peace, and then a week. The news coming from the north were still strangely vague and fragmented. Then, however, that peace was spoiled by a sudden and dangerous development. Sunny was staring at the black waves that came and went, licking the stone shore not too far away from the tall wall of the fortress, even though he had told his soldiers to stay away from the ocean. Sunny came here once or twice every day, perhaps hoping to see the fearsome silhouette of the giant battleship emerging from the darkness. That was silly, of course, since the arrival of their ride away from Low 49 was days or even weeks away. Still, he found himself in a contemplative mood whenever he observed the waves. He was also reasonably sure in his ability to get away should anything other than Ariadne appear from the ocean. The blizzard finally subsided a few hours ago, so today Sunny saw much further than before. Not that there was anything to see. Shivering in the cold, he sighed and turned around to go find warmth inside one of the station's buildings. It was at that moment that Sunny froze and tilted his head, as if listening to something. His eyes narrowed. Sunny breathed a quiet curse. The maddening whispers assaulting his mind had just grown much louder, jumping off the wall. Sunny walked quickly and soon reached the security center of the facility. There, several awakened were monitoring the sensor feeds, Verne was standing in front of a wall of screens with a dark expression on his face. Hearing Sunny's steps, he turned his head. Verne asked, "You felt it too?" Sunny nodded. Sunny replied, "Yeah, it's strong." Verne closed his eyes for a few moments. Verne muttered, "This complicates things." That was an understatement. What they sensed was the call, which had suddenly grown much stronger. That meant two things, none of them promising anything good to the people isolated inside Low 49. The first thing was rather obvious. Somewhere out there, very close to the facility, one or more nightmare gates had just opened. Considering how loud the call was, Sunny was willing to bet that there were two of them, at least. The second thing wasn't immediately dangerous, but vastly more insidious. Verne gritted his teeth, then sighed and pressed a few buttons on the console in front of him. Then he spoke, his voice being carried all across the fortress by the integrated speakers.
Attention all awakened personnel, this is Master Verne speaking, effective immediately. The interference status of the Low 49 facility should be considered to be changed from green to yellow, I repeat.
Sunny's face was bleak, with the strength of the call growing so much. The stability of the gateway anchors of the awakened inside the fortress was bound to become weaker. It wasn't at the stage where falling asleep would definitely lead to being thrown into an unknown region of the dream realm. Yet, but close to it, what it really meant was that, from now on, falling asleep within the walls of Low 49 was a gamble for all awakened defending it. The probability of becoming pulled away by the seed of nightmare wasn't high, but it was also not zero.
Damnation.
Worse still, there were the gates themselves to deal with, considering that they had to have opened close enough to strengthen the call. The nightmare creatures brought by them would undoubtedly come to visit, attracted by the smell of human souls. Finishing his announcement, Verne looked at Sunny with weary eyes. Sunny nodded. Sunny said, "I am on it." 4 shadows burst from his figure, swiftly gliding across the floor and leaving the security center a second later. They flew across the facility, climbed its walls, and plunged into the cold dark night beyond. Verne, meanwhile, started giving orders to his subordinates. Soon, junior officers of the security force, which numbered close to a battalion, were summoned from all over Low 49, considering their expertise and rank. The devils were naturally included in this list. By the time everyone arrived, Sunny's shadows were already scouring the vicinity of the fortress, searching for the manifested gates. Verne briefed his people on what had happened as he spoke. The faces of the soldiers changed slightly, knowing that they were going into battle soon. Only the irregulars remained nonchalant. Finally, Sunny sighed. Sunny murmured, "Found it." The coastal plain didn't have a lot of geographic features, so it was easy to discover the menacing rift that tore apart reality. He was slightly surprised that there was only one gate, but then again, it seemed to be a potent one. As everyone stared at him, Sunny winced slightly.
There's a single gate about 3 kilometers away from the northern wall. It seemed to be Category 3.
The mundane soldiers among them paled, and even awakened seemed disturbed. He didn't pay them attention.
The nightmare creatures are, wait, what the hell?
He frowned. Usually, a gate disgorged nightmare creatures of similar origin, at least during the first wave. These ones, however, were all over the place. Some were comically small, while some were large. Some were bestial, while some were bipedal. It was a whole menagerie of monsters.
The nightmare creatures all look different from each other.
A fierce scowl appeared on Verne's face.
The scavengers, and we fought their kind before, and they start weak, but quickly grow stronger by devouring corpses. They inherit qualities of the things that they eat, too. Younger abominations are easy to deal with, but the older ones are truly vile.
Sunny pondered for a bit.
I see. Well, we seem to be in luck. There are about 300 them, and I only see 2 corrupted. The gate guardian is a demon.
The soldiers shuddered and stared at him with a bit of resentment. If that was what the captain of the irregular considered luck, then what the hell could be called misfortune? 300 powerful nightmare creatures led by 2 corrupted, against 100 awakened, 2 masters, and 1,000 mundane servicemen of the local garrison. The The situation didn't look too good. Sunny lingered for a few moments, and then smiled.
Ah, and the last piece of news, the bastards have caught our scent, so they're already heading here.
There wasn't much time to prepare and make plans, since the abominations were going to reach low 49 in mere minutes. The shrill alarms blasted throughout the facility, and powereal spotlights ignited on its walls. Flooding the snow-covered plain with light, civilians rushed to shelters, while soldiers ran to man the defensive fortifications. Sunny and his cohort followed, summoning their memories as they calmly prepared for battle. As they walked through bitter cold, he spoke.
After we deal with the nightmare creatures, everyone is to remain awake until we board the ship. You know the drill. We won't be sleeping for a week, at least, maybe 2. Get the stimulants from Quentin and keep each other in check.
The devils grumbled. They had already completed a few long missions in areas where sleep was deadly. A week was unpleasant, but doable. 2 weeks, however, was going to be a hellish challenge.
I just hope that Ariadne arrives on time.
It wasn't like they had any acceptable choice other than sit and wait. At that moment, someone called out to Sunny.
Hey, you, Master Sunless or whatever, what's going on?
He looked to the side and saw Bate, Professor Obel's assistant, shivering in the cold in her civilian clothes and flimsy lab coat. The young woman's hair was gathered in a bun, like always, but a few stubborn locks had wrestled free and were now dancing in the wind. Her pale face wore an irritated scowl, but he could see fear and alarm hiding behind that temperamental mask. In the past week, Sunny had spent most of his time with or near the scientists. When he was away, one of his shadows usually kept watch. He had spoken with the old man a lot, learning all kinds of things about the tumultuous times of the first generation, the world before that, and the scientific understanding, or rather, the lack of it, of the nightmare spell. So, he had come to know Bate rather well. 2. That was why he knew for a fact that she was pretending to barely remember his name on purpose.
Gods, she's even more petty than I am.
As the bleak steel of the undying chain appeared from nothingness and embraced his body, Sunny looked at the young woman and smiled.
What do you think is going on? There's a big gate and a lot of nasty nightmare creatures coming this way. We'll go deal with them real quick. You head back, gather the scientists, and lock yourselves in the safe room, all right.
She lingered for a moment, then nodded. Sunny muttered, "Yeah, all right." With that, Bate turned around and ran back into the door of the research center. Sunny shook his head and continued forward. Soon, they reached the top of the northern wall and observed the vast expanse of the coastal plain. None of the abominations had reached the facility yet, but it was just a matter of time as turret towers whined, ramping up their engines. Samara placed her rifle on the lip of the wall and looked through its scope. Verne, who was now clad in polished plate armor, holding a shield and a short sword in his hands, looked at Sunny. Verne asked, "What do you think?" Sunny remained silent for a moment. His shadows were still following the swarm of nightmare creatures, so he was studying them. He had been honest, of course, when he said that they were lucky as far as Category 3 gates went. This one was surprisingly weak. He was even confused by the fact that it affected the strength of the call so much. The power of the wave of abominations brought by it was incomparable to the stone hive. For example, back then, the irregulars had to face a whole score of corrupted creatures. This time, there were only 2, and the strongest of them was merely a demon. Of course, the word merely could hardly be applied to a corrupted demon, but still. Finally, Sunny spoke.
It's not a big deal. I will deal with the gate guardian, and you deal with the other corrupted. Awakened Kim will support you. Can you handle it?
Asking an average awakened to fight a fallen abomination wasn't an easy request. However, asking an average master to face a corrupted one was less so, because all masters were elites by definition. There was a fundamental distinction between awakened and ascended, since most of the former had no choice in what they had become, but the latter could only be what they were by choice. So, Sunny was reasonably sure that Verne would survive a battle against a corrupted scavenger. The local master hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sunny said, "I'll handle it." Sunny grinned. Sunny remarked, "That's the spirit." With that, he stepped forward and leaped off the wall into the cold darkness below. The soldiers of the garrison seemed startled by his sudden jump, but the devils remained nonchalant. They were long accustomed to their captain's bizarre actions, landing on the snow. Sunny considered the situation for a moment. He was thinking whether he should summon Saint. Eventually, he decided against it, for now. Her help would only be needed if the enemy turned out to be more dangerous than he had judged. Sunny did, however, summon the Sin of Solace, as his hand took hold of the onyx hilt of the beautiful longsword. Ghostly whispers assaulted his mind. It was already strained by the insidious and exhausting pull of the call, so the additional burden seemed even heavier. Sunny winced and shook his head, chasing them away.
So annoying.
The Sin of Solace scratched at his sanity, its murmurs slowly growing clearer, louder, more insistent. At that moment, Samara's rifle discharged, and the sound of a magical slug breaking the sound barrier boomed from somewhere above. A moment later, the turrets came to life, sending a hail of tungsten rounds into the swarm of approaching abominations. Grinning, Sunny sent essence flowing into his muscles and chased after the bullets. 4 shadows flew across the snow, following the swarm of nightmare creatures, as a shining slug flashed through the darkness, gruesomely tearing apart one of the monsters. They surged forward and fused with a lonely figure that was running to meet the charging abominations. In the next moment, several streams of tracer rounds swept across the first row of the swarm, sending pieces of bone armor and chunks of flesh flying into the cold air. Sunny wrapped one of his shadows around his body, one around his armor, and one around his blade. The last slid past and flew back to the tall wall of the low 49 installation. Its task was to find Professor Obel and stand watch, should something unexpected happen in the civilian shelter. Sadly, the turrets hadn't been as effective as Sunny had hoped. Several abominations were slowed down or wounded, but most of the bullets bounced off their tough hides ineffectively. The defense systems of the fortress continued to rain hellfire on the nightmare creatures, though tearing the silent night apart with bright muzzle flashes and the thundering staccato of the fusillade. Long plumes of fire bloomed from the thick barrels of the turrets like the breath of a dragon.
I need to be careful not to be shot in the back.
Lunging forward, Sunny clashed with the vanguard of the approaching swarm. He didn't really have time to engage with the mass of grotesque scavengers, especially because each of them possessed unique shape and abilities. Even with Sunny's power, there was a risk of drowning in the tide of abominations simply for the lack of understanding of them. Still, he could slow them down a little bit. At least, the jade blade of the Sin of Solace drew a line across an awakened monster's body. Seamlessly parting it in two, Sunny was still amazed by the power of the beautiful, cursed sword. It felt so light in his hands that it almost seemed as though they were empty, and cut through the bodies of his enemies so easily as if not meeting any resistance at all. It felt like he was cutting water with a blade made of air. Despite its length, the jade giant was incredibly nimble and swift. It almost demanded to be used, to dance gracefully through the air while shedding rivers of blood. For that reason, Sunny had to adjust his technique a little. The Sin of Solace was comparable to the Odachi he had grown accustomed to in terms of sheer size, but it was much lighter. It had a double-edged blade, too, and a sharp point that was perfectly suited for lethal thrusts. Although the foundational mechanics of using the two-handed giant were the same, it was better suited for a more agile, swift, unpredictable, and devious swordplay, luckily. Sunny was proficient in using all kinds of weapons and battle styles, weaving them together to achieve the optimal outcome. Not that he needed a lot of technical skill to slaughter these pathetic abominations. For these waifs, pure speed was enough, severing the first creature in half. He shifted his weight slightly, made a step to the side, and easily beheaded another. This one was a fallen, so its flesh presented more resistance to the jade blade of the Sin of Solace. However, it was still eerily easy to cut it down. Black blood rained on the white snow by the time Sunny finished off the 2 stragglers that had broken away from the swarm. The mass of abominations already reached him, instead of clashing with countless nightmare creatures. He simply dissolved into shadows and appeared 24 meters away. In the midst of them, the Sin of Solace whistled through the air, reaping another life. Then, he was gone again, just like that. Jumping from one abomination to another, Sunny soon reached the heart of the scavenger mob. where the gate guardian towered above the lesser creatures. The corrupted demon was different from the rest of them. It was taller, stronger, and seemed much more ancient. Most importantly, it filled Sunny with a cold feeling of dread. His intuition was ringing alarm, screaming at him that this foe was strong, dangerous, perilous, deadly. The creature resembled a giant with a body that was covered by pale, strangely organic, bone-like armor. It was littered with deep scars and signs of corrosion, but seemed almost impossible to break. On the demon's face, or rather, instead of its face, a single bone protrusion extended forward like a vicious horn. Sunny hesitated for a split second.
You are an ugly one, huh?
Then, there was no time to think. The demon noticed him almost before Sunny had appeared from the shadows, and brought his devastating fists down, aiming to crush the enemy into a puddle of blood. Sunny silently cursed and jumped back. The gate guardian struck nothing but the cold ground, splitting it open and causing a small earthquake with this single blow. A powerful shockwave spread from the point of impact, throwing several nightmare creatures down. If a mundane human had happened to be nearby, just this shockwave alone would have been enough to rupture their organs, killing them on the spot. Sunny, fortunately, wasn't mundane. His armor and ascended body absorbed the shock, and all he felt was a little rattle. The localized earthquake, nevertheless, was violent enough to throw him to the ground. Sunny groaned. Ah, not good. Usually, in a battle against something so powerful, losing his footing would have meant death. A corrupted demon was fast enough to unleash a finishing blow long before the enemy managed to get back up and regain their mobility. In this case, however, no attack followed. The shadows in the place where the creature's fists landed suddenly surged forward and wrapped themselves around its wrists like black shackles. The gate guardian tried to straighten and unleash another blow, but was pulled back down by the shadow bindings. It let out a rambling growl that rolled across the battlefield like an ill omen and strained its mighty muscles. A moment later, the dark shackles exploded into a myriad of shards, and it was free again. That moment was all Sunny had needed, though. Using the short window of opportunity, Sunny jumped back to his feet, dashed forward, and thrust his jade sword into a small crack between two plates of armor that covered the giant's knee joint. The thin blade of the Sin of Solace easily slid into it and bit into the demon's flesh, drawing a few drops of putrid black blood. That was all he had time to do before leaping back. The shallow wound Sunny had delivered was by no means mortal, or even seriously debilitating. But it didn't need to be. The plague of the sinister whisper had already been passed to the gate guardian by the swift jade blade.
Let's see how strong your mind is, bastard.
Even diminished by the potent mental barrier of the undying chain, the eerie whispers of the Sin of Solace were constantly assaulting his own sanity. Of course, it was strange to think of any nightmare creature as sane. They were all mad to begin with, after all, but Sunny had high hopes. A demon was a demon, no matter how wicked. It was still a sentient being. That sentience, which made these creatures so dangerous, could also be destroyed. The gate guardian finally unleashed another attack, this one so fast that Sunny barely had time to react. With no other choice, he gritted his teeth and blocked it with the blade of the Sin of Solace. Another shockwave exploded outward, and he was thrown back like a cannonball. Sunny cursed under his breath. Crap. Sunny flew back, smashing into several nightmare creatures on his way. Several devastating impacts rattled his entire body, and bits of broken flesh flew into the air, landing dozens of meters away from the gate guardian. He collided against the ground, bounced, and then rolled for a bit, leaving a deep groove in the snow. Throughout all of it, there was a vicious smile on his lips, however. That was because he had managed to deliver a cut to the wrist of the demon just before his block crumbled. The giant was already near, so Sunny rose without wasting any time and dashed forward to meet him, for a short stretch of time which, nevertheless, felt like an eternity. He danced around the corrupted abomination, diving through the shadows and using shadow manifestation. Sunny was able to just barely stay ahead of the terrifying creature by a split second. Several more shallow wounds appeared on the giant's body, drops of blood rolling down its bone armor. At first, the demon didn't seem to be affected at all. Then, however, first, his movement slowed down a little, becoming slightly erratic. Then his body grew tense. The creature twitched and suddenly struck itself in the head, as if trying to shake off a dizzy spell. The more wounds accumulated on the giant's body, the louder the whispers of the sinister blade grew. Eventually, the demon froze in an awkward pose, its arms hanging limp and its neck twisted at a strange angle. It remained motionless for few long, tense seconds. Then, a chilling roar escaped from its maw, making the world shake. Sunny breathed. What the? As the gate guardian's insanity, or whatever it was that guided its perverse sentience collapsed. An endless sea of bloodlust and frenzy seemed to overwhelm the abomination, letting out a bestial growl. It moved again and lunged at Sunny like a mountain of muscle, bone, and murderous rage. Sunny stared at that frightening sight for a short moment, then calmly stepped through shadows and appeared 20 or so meters behind the crazed horror. His disappearance didn't seem to affect the demon much. Maybe the broken abomination didn't even notice it, consumed by rabid, long arms forward, grabbed the nearest nightmare creature, and brutally ripped it apart. Then, not satisfied by the ghastly sight of the ruptured corpse, it howled and dove into the surrounding swarm, crushing and tearing bodies to shreds just in a few seconds. The crazed demon killed more nightmare creatures than Sunny had on his way to meet it.
Damn.
Looking at the rampaging gate guardian, Sunny couldn't help but shudder. Sin of Solace was truly a frightening weapon. Did it only seem so, or had the whispers of the jade blade grew a little clearer? He really felt like he could learn to understand them if he just listened a little bit closer. A little bit longer. Yes, surely he would. The rest of the battle didn't take long. Vernes awakened and the devils fought the swarm of scavengers at the front, while the frenzied demon decimated its center. Many nightmare creatures tried to attack the gate guardian to save their lives, but all of them failed. Sunny didn't. However, felling a mindless enemy was infinitely easier than a cunning one, and the maddened giant seemed to have lost all its ability to think straight. Being consumed by the curse of the sinister whisper, it had turned into a rabid beast. Sunny used that to his advantage, pulling the attention of the corrupted demon toward other abominations while he methodically worked on dismantling its armor. The trick was to remain out of sight and only attack the giant from the back. Of course, navigating through the swarm of abominations without being cornered wasn't an easy task. But the havoc consuming the battlefield was so thorough that Sunny had even less trouble with that task than usual. Eventually, he bled the gate guardian, diminished its power with dozens of cuts, and finally pierced its black, wildly contorting heart. A few moments later, the voice of the spell reached his ears through the clamor of battle.
You've slain a corrupted demon, Myriad Eater, and your shadow grows stronger.
The giant's corpse crashed to the ground, making it tremble. Sunny stared at it for a moment, surprised. A corrupted demon. Suddenly, he remembered his first moments on the forgotten shore and the monstrous shark that had almost scared him to death. It was a corrupted creature, too, either a demon or a devil. Considering the 2 soul shards that the carapace centurions later harvested from the half of the carcass that a much more harrowing being had left behind. Who could have thought that, one day, he would be killing abominations comparable to that fearsome monstrosity? Shaking his head, Sunny brandished the Sin of Solace and looked around. It was time to clean up the rest of the mess. Although awakened were still fighting the remnants of the scavenger swarm, the battle was more or less over. The gate guardian was dead, and Verne had handled the other corrupted abomination with Kim's support. Belle, Dorn, and Samara had hunted down the most dangerous fallen while the local garrison eradicated the rest. By now, only the weakest nightmare creatures remained. They were still deadly, of course. But the scavengers didn't seem too dangerous unless they were old and had devoured a lot of powerful enemies. The lesser ones even succumbed to their bestial instincts and got distracted from the fight, forgetting everything to sink teeth into the flesh of the slain members of their own kind. For them, any world was a dog-eat-dog world. Sunny prowled the battlefield for a while, searching for fallen abominations in hopes of earning a shadow fragment or two. Sadly, it seemed that there were none left. The rest of the defenders of Low 49 were quite thorough. Eventually, He gave up and joined the soldiers of the garrison in cleaning up the remaining enemies. What followed was a swift but tedious chore. They quickly swept the field where the ground was drenched by blood and littered with the revolting corpses, slaughtering the last of the scavengers. At some point, Sunny found himself back near the corpse of the corrupted demon he had defeated. Since there was nothing much left for him to do, he decided to dig out the soul shards from the massive carcass. With these, both Luster and Kim would probably be able to fully saturate their cores, thus bringing the cohort to its optimal strength. The other members had long achieved full saturation, leaving only these two. Still, even they were awfully close, heading for the dead giant with greed shining in his eyes. Sunny accidentally heard the subdued voices of the awakened from the local garrison. One of them murmured, "Gods, look at that monstrosity." Damn, I heard rumors, of course, but to see it with my own eyes, he really went a corrupted demon it alone. Yeah, it was scary, I couldn't see much, but their battle must have been a fierce one. 1/3 of the whole swarm was destroyed simply because the bastards got caught in the crossfire. Can you believe that? I guess they call him Devil for a reason. Hiding a small smile, Sunny stepped close to the carcass of the Myriad Eater and raised the Sin of Solace, planning to cut through the tough bone plate on its chest. Then, however, he tilted his head a little. There were strange sounds coming from the other side of the dead giant. Nyam nyam, crunch, nom nom, slurp. Frowning, he noiselessly jumped on top of the massive corpse and looked down. There, a tiny scavenger was greedily biting into the tough flesh of the dead demon. The pathetic creature looked like a gaunt, starved gremlin that was only as tall as Sunny's knee. It had a mouth full of sharp, triangular teeth, though, which were doing a surprisingly good job of tearing into the corrupted corpse.
I guess even nightmare creatures have runts.
As Sunny watched, the little imp tore a piece of bloody meat off with its teeth, raised its head, and swallowed the chunk of its former master's flesh with an excited snarl. It was then that the vermin noticed the human looking at him from above, perhaps because of the omen of dread enchantment of the Sin of Solace, or perhaps because the adolescent abomination had enough brain to feel terror in front of a superior predator. Its eyes widened in fear. The tiny scavenger froze for a moment. Then it shrieked and dashed away from the carcass of the Myriad Eater, trying to run away. Sunny blinked. Sunny muttered, "Well, that's a first." Since he didn't want to waste essence on shadow manifestation, he simply summoned the prowling thorn. By the time the heavy kunai manifested itself into his hand, the vile critter was already far away, not bothered too much. Sunny aimed and sent the kunai flying. The scavenger was a split second away from dying, but at the last moment, it tripped and pathetically tumbled down. As a result, the blade of the kunai only sliced 2 fingers off its hand. Sunny scowled and pulled on the invisible string, summoning the prowling thorn back to throw it again. This time, he wasn't going to miss. Suppressing the whispers of the Sin of Solace and the oppressive pull of the call, he banished every other thought away and concentrated solely on the tiny figure of the fleeing imp. It was then that someone said, in a tone of cold disdain, "Fool." Sunny flinched and looked around. Sunny demanded, "Huh, who said that?" Although the familiar voice sounded as if it came from somewhere very close by, there was no one else around. Come to think of it, Sunny knew that voice very well. It was his own voice. Confused, he scratched the back of his head with the tip of the prowling thorn. Sunny wondered, was that an intrusive thought? Because of the sudden distraction, the wounded scavenger was getting farther and farther away. More importantly, though, Sunny's concentration was broken. All the information he had been ignoring to make a good throw flooded into his mind. His eyes widened. Sunny called, "Professor." Sunny flinched and turned around, staring in the direction of the research installation. There, deep below one of the science buildings, around 100 civilians were locked in a heavily reinforced shelter, nervously waiting for the soldiers of the garrison to announce that it was safe to come out. Professor Obel and his assistant, Bate, were among them. There was also another person in the shelter, someone who had been quietly sitting in a dark corner, dozing off. Until a few seconds ago, Sunny whispered, "No, no, no." Sunny jumped off the demon's corpse and dove into the shadows, stepping through them to appear in the shelter. However, he knew that he wouldn't be able to appear there in time. A few moments was more than enough for the worst to happen, so he made a swift decision. In the short moment that it took him to complete the shadow step, a sharp pain suddenly pierced his very being. It only took Sunny a split second to understand what had happened. One of the scientists locked in the shelter had fallen asleep. In their sleep, that person had been pulled into the first nightmare and died. Perhaps the trial of the spell was especially harsh, or perhaps the scientist was especially weak. Perhaps luck was simply not on their side. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the seed of nightmare in their soul bloomed. And a deadly abomination was unleashed into the waking world. Crimson blood on the white lab coat, a grotesque figure that resembled a ghastly amalgamation of a human and a monstrous mannequin made of flesh, screams of fear, eyes full of shock. Even though the nightmare creature had just been born, it already unleashed its murderous madness on the defenseless civilians in the shelter. Everyone was late to react. The automated defense systems, the sentries posted in the bunker. Even Sunny himself, although he was already diving into the shadows, he knew that the short moment it would take him to travel the vast distance between the blood-soaked battlefield and the shelter could mean the difference between life and death for Professor Obel. Summoning Saint was a fast affair, but it, too, took a second or two to complete. So, he went for a measure that would be immediate, using shadow manifestation. He commanded the shadow that had been observing the old scientist to assume a tangible form and resist the frenzied nightmare creature. Almost instantly, a sharp pain pierced his very being. The shadow sustained damage, which meant that his soul did too. No matter how many times Sunny had endured soul attacks, the sheer agony of them was still a shock. A single heartbeat later, he rolled out of the shadows nestling in the corners of the underground shelter and looked around, trying to evaluate the situation through the pain. It had been only several seconds since the unfortunate scientist turned into a grotesque abomination. Still, several people that had been close to the transformed monstrosity were already dead. Their severed limbs littered the floor, which was slick with blood. The creature itself was lunging at a group of terrified civilians, among whom were the dazed professor and Bait. The young woman was trying to shield the old man with her body, which was useless, considering that the creature wouldn't be slowed down at all by her fragile, mundane flesh. Screams of horror filled the air. However, the abomination seemed to be stuck in place. That was because an arrogant shadow was standing between the monstrosity and the scientist, pushing it back with a hand. Its other hand was wrapped around a bone scythe that had pierced the shadow's side, preventing it from cutting deeper. Unlike Sunny himself, the shadow didn't show any sign of being in pain. Well, of course. The haughty bastard was utterly above breaking decorum because of a small and inconsequential thing like being skewered by a nightmare creature's blade. More than that, it would never stoop so low as to show weakness or discomfort in front of its lessers, which was everyone. Everyone in Two Worlds was, naturally, its lesser. Sunny muttered, "That guy." Right then, the haughty shadow raised one leg and kicked the abomination in the abdomen, sending it stumbling back. Then, it disappeared, turning back into a black silhouette on the floor. Its job was already done, jumping over a body of one of the killed scientists. Sunny flashed through the underground shelter and attacked the nightmare creature before it could regain its balance. The sin of solace passed through the abomination without meeting almost any resistance. And then, the grisly mutant silently fell to the ground. It was only then that the sentries managed to raise their rifles, and the turrets mounted on the ceiling came to life, swinging in the direction of the dismantled abomination. Sunny had been faster than all of them.
You've slain an awakened monster, Bone Slayer.
But still, standing above the dead creature, Sunny scowled, a dark expression appearing on his face. He had missed it. He had been distracted and lost awareness of what was happening around him. That wasn't like Sunny. Sunny asked, "How did this happen?" He had been keeping an eye on the professor even while fighting the Myriad Eater. But then, at some point, his attention was drawn elsewhere. Was it because of the call? Was it because of the sin of solace? or simply because of the accumulated exhaustion of having to fight intense battles one after another. A combination of all these reasons. In any case, Sunny wasn't happy with himself. The pain lingering in his wounded soul served as a reminder of his failure. He had killed a corrupted demon and won the battle, but almost failed his mission. Countless people had almost died. With a grim sigh, Sunny dismissed the jade sword and the helmet of the undying chain, revealing his pale face and hair, which was damp with sweat. Then, he looked around one more time. Counting the dead and observing the fearful expressions of those who survived, 6 victims in just a few seconds. It could have been much, much worse.
Master Sunless, you are here. One of the soldiers called out to him, still aiming at the unmoving abomination. Sunny exhaled slowly, then looked at Professor Obel, making sure that he was okay. Bait was still shielding him, slow to realize that the threat had been dealt with. Yeah, you can lower your rifles, it's dead.
He lingered for a moment, and then addressed the terrified crowd of civilians.
Someone failed their first nightmare, but it's over now. The battle upstairs is over, too. We won, you should all be safe now. Lily for now.
Of course, he didn't say that last part aloud. Instead, Sunny stared at the bodies once again and gritted his teeth. This was the first time when a victory felt so bitter. In fact, despite having killed one of his most powerful foes yet, Sunny didn't feel like he had won anything at all. Things were getting worse and worse with each day, a week, 2 weeks. How many more people would die before the Ariadne arrived to take them all away? Standing in a puddle of blood with hundreds of frightened civilians looking at him with gratitude and relief, Sunny had no answer. After cleaning up the unexpected gate, things settled down within the walls of Low 49. For the next few days, Sunny and his soldiers didn't have a lot to do. They just had to rest, remain vigilant, and above all else, stay awake. That task turned out surprisingly hard for Sunny. As an ascended, he should have had no problem with keeping himself from falling asleep for a couple of weeks. However, because of the damage his souls had sustained, he felt weak and strangely lethargic. Minutes and hours passed with an excruciating slowness, but his mental exhaustion didn't seem to diminish with the passage of time. Instead, it only grew, aggravated by the insidious pressure of the call. Of course, soul wounds weren't permanent. They healed naturally over time, and that one in particular wasn't even the worst one Sunny had ever received. The haughty shadow, too, was on its way to full recovery. The other shadows fussed around it a lot, but the arrogant guy pretended to not care. Secretly, though he seemed to be enjoying all the attention, Sunny muttered under his breath, "Don't sleep, don't sleep, don't sleep." On top of the wall overseeing the dark ocean, Sunny pressed his forehead against the lip of the wall and then lightly struck his head against it several times. Sunny sighed. Ah, how annoying. There was nothing useful for him to do in the research facility, which only aggravated the dangerous feeling of boredom. They were disconnected from the network, which meant that he couldn't access any entertainment or receive messages from Rain. They couldn't travel to the dream realm, making the tiresome isolation complete. Of course, he could immerse himself in all kinds of interesting endeavors. Sunny could continue his experiments with weaving, or hold an engaging conversation with Professor Obel. He could go and check how much Luster and Kim had improved after saturating their cores. But all of that demanded mental strain, which would only make him more tired. That damned ship couldn't arrive any sooner. As he was resentfully contemplating the situation, a lone figure ascended the wall and approached him. It was Bait, who seemed to be searching for Sunny. For some reason, she was a long parka on top of the usual lab coat. He looked at her bleakly and asked. Sunny asked, "What?" She glowered.
What do you mean, what? Can't I look at the ocean too?
Sunny stared at her for a moment, then turned away. Sunny offered, "Be my guest." The young woman remained silent for a while. After a minute or two passed in silence, she said awkwardly,
Anyway, about what happened that time, I guess you aren't completely useless for a master.
Sunny smiled with a corner of his mouth.
Is this your way of saying thank you?
Beth looked down, but then answered with unexpected sincerity.
Yes, I mean, thank you, from me and all the other scientists. If it wasn't for you, Professor might have.
He studied the black waves silently.
Thank me. If I did my job well, that wouldn't have happened in the first place. I was negligent.
The young woman suddenly scoffed, ruining the somber mood.
Gosh, how cool. You are very full of yourself, aren't you, Master Sunless?
Sunny simply grinned.
Naturally, who else am I going to be full of?
Bates sighed.
Still, you are a human too. Awakened often seem to forget that fact. So don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep the professor alive, that's enough.
He nodded. Sunny replied, "That's the plan." With that, she lingered for a few moments, and then left him alone. Sunny stared into the distance, imagining the formidable silhouette of the battleship appearing on the horizon.
When I get out of this place, I am going to sleep for a week straight. Arg, no, don't think about sleep, sleep, sleep.
He grimaced, then slapped himself and turned around. It was time to go and find himself a cup of strong, bitter coffee. The next morning, which was no different from the evening, a familiar figure approached the Rhino. Sunny, who was sitting on its roof and fiddling with a stimulator patch, looked down and raised his eyebrow. Sunny asked, "Verne, did something happen?" The tall ascended looked up and remained silent for a few moments. There were dark circles under his calm, weary eyes. Verne replied, "Yes, something happened." Sunny frowned, suddenly feeling uneasy. Sunny asked, "Well, what's it?" Verne sighed. Verne said, "One of my soldiers is missing." The missing soldier had disappeared from the living quarters in the middle of the night. The man's absence was noticed in the morning, when he failed to assume his post. He was one of the 100 awakened of the local garrison, an experienced warrior who had been on track to becoming an officer. Tardiness wasn't in his nature. As Sunny and Verne walked toward the building where the soldier had resided, there was a tense atmosphere around them. Sunny was asking the obvious questions. Sunny asked, "Have you searched the facility?" The other master nodded.
Yes, every area that he could have access to, there's no sign of him anywhere.
Sunny frowned. People didn't just vanish into thin air. Well, usually they didn't, especially with no one noticing.
What about security cameras? Did they record anything?
Verne gritted his teeth, then shook his head.
Most of the observation system went down during the blizzard. What little remains is almost useless because of the interference from the scavenger gate. There are no recordings that we can use.
They arrived at the barracks and proceeded to the missing soldier's personal room, in front of which a few awakened were already crowding with worried expressions on their faces. Walking inside, Sunny felt his unease growing stronger. That was because there was nothing. Nothing in the small room said that something had happened there. There were no signs of a struggle, no drops of blood, no unusual smells lingering in the air, even with his special eyes and unnatural intuition. He couldn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Still, Sunny made a point of studying every small detail, both with his vision and shadow sense. He sent his shadows to sweep through the facility, too, with no result whatsoever. The soldier had, indeed, somehow vanished into thin air after a while. Sunny looked at Verne and asked a somewhat awkward question. Sunny ventured, could he have deserted? Verne stared at him blankly. Verne countered, where would he go? Sunny nodded. Even if someone had lost their mind and decided to run away from the remote station, there was nowhere for them to go. The other master, meanwhile, gritted his teeth.
I hoped that you would be able to notice something that I missed. Have you found anything?
Sunny remained silent for a while. Eventually, he sighed tiredly and shook his head. Sunny muttered, "No, nothing." The awakened warrior was simply gone. The whole facility was swept, both by the soldiers of the garrison and Sunny's shadows, but no trace of him were found. Verne even made the decision to unseal the dome of the old observatory. However, there was nothing but old equipment, darkness, and dust inside. Sunny then sent his shadows to scour the coastal plain outside the fortress. Hoping to discover a clue, he didn't. A sense of unease and foreboding spread through the isolated fortress, as people were crowding together to alleviate this tension. Sunny, Verne, and Professor Obel gathered in the security center to have an emergency discussion. However, none of them seemed too eager to speak first. They simply had nothing to say. Eventually, Sunny rubbed his face with a sigh.
Well, there are only 3 possibilities, right?
Verne looked at him darkly. Sunny asked, "And there?" Sunny hesitated for a moment. Sunny said, "First, he might have really deserted." The stern master simply shook his head. There was no hostility or defensiveness in this gesture, since Verne wasn't the type of leader to be insecure about his people or himself. He didn't have the kind of fragile pride that would make the statement sound offensive.
That's improbable. I know this awakened very well. He is a stalwart man.
Sunny moved on with a shrug.
Still, that would be the best outcome. The other 2 possibilities are much more troublesome.
A tired frown appeared on his face.
The second possibility is that he was killed, for whatever reason, by another person stationed at Low 49. The killer subsequently disposed of the body and removed the signs of the crime, considering that it's not easy for a mundane human to kill an awakened. The most likely suspect would be one of your people, Verne.
Professor Obel let out a heavy sigh.
Surely, you don't think that one of these brave soldiers...
Sunny looked at him with a somber expression.
I am just exploring what could have happened. However, don't be mistaken. We awakened are always only 1 step away from turning into monsters. With how much pressure Antarctica exerts on people, many will inevitably start to break. In any case, we should pay attention to those awakened that have aspects suitable for getting rid of incriminating evidence. Verne, you know your soldiers best, so this task will be on you.
Verne pursed his lips, but then silently nodded. Sunny asked, "What about the last possibility?" Sunny lingered for a few moments.
There might be a nightmare creature that has infiltrated the facility and is now hiding somewhere within these walls. Considering that we failed to find any traces at all, it has to be either very powerful, very elusive, or both. Since I am the best scout among us, investigating this possibility will be my task.
Verne remained silent for a while, then said somberly,
That sounds like a plan. However, what happens if neither of us discovers anything?
Sunny looked at him. His eyes were full darkness.
Then we just need to wait for the Ariadne to arrive and hope that no one else disappears. According to the last communication we had with the outside, it'll reach us in 4 days at the earliest and in 11 at the latest. Surely, we can hold out for that long.
As he spoke, the persistent noise of the call kept scratching, pressing, seeping into his mind. Verne closed his eyes for a moment.
Then that's what we will do.
Verne started investigating his own soldiers, while Sunny climbed back on top of the Rhino and sent his shadows to explore Low 49 for the 3rd time that day. He had little hope of finding anything, but the thought of an elusive, uncanny horror hiding somewhere within the confines of the fortress, waiting to snatch its next victim, prevented him from remaining idle. At least he had something to do now. People locked inside the facility had already been tense and exhausted, but with a new, unknown threat looming somewhere just out of sight, their moods grew even more bleak and unstable. Most held up fine. For now, due to the hope of the Ariadne arriving soon, Sunny knew all about hope and how important it was in situations like these. While the search went on, new safety protocols went effect. Mundane humans were prohibited from remaining alone, and a mutual responsibility system was established to keep anyone from succumbing to the first nightmare unexpectedly. Living quarters were fitted with additional sensors and alarm locks. Awakened were supplied with powerful stimulants to remain awake, and so on. Many soldiers were pulled off the walls to reinforce internal patrols and make sure that the protocols were followed. There was no established tradition of dealing with a crisis like this, since the chain of nightmares had changed the rules of the game, cut off from army command. Verne was forced to come up with enhanced measures on his own. Luckily, Professor Obel was able to help out. The old man still had memories of the cataclysmic descent of the spell, and of how the first generation had dealt with similar problems, isolated from the outside world and surrounded by an unknown number of active gates. Low 49 was holding on as best as it could, but was it good enough? Sunny didn't know. Sunny muttered, "Damn it, damn it, damn it." To his frustration, he failed to find any proof that an unknown nightmare creature was hiding somewhere in the settlement. His shadows had explored every corner of the fortress, both above and below the ground, as well as many kilometers of the snow-covered coastal plain beyond the walls, but all of it was to no avail. Either the abomination was too cunning, possessed truly frightening powers, or it simply didn't exist. Verne failed to discover anything, as well, at some point. Sunny found himself studying the spot where his cohort and the garrison of Low 49 had defeated the scavengers. Two of his shadows were sniffing around the battlefield. One was studying the distant gate, and one was keeping an eye on Professor Obel.
Maybe that soldier really just ran away. I looked everywhere. There's just no sign of anything.
He was almost ready to believe that theory. It was then that a tall figure approached the rhino. Sunny shivered in the cold and walked to the edge of the APC's roof, then looked down on Verne, experiencing a sense of déjà vu. His heart suddenly fell. Sunny asked, "What happened?" Verne stared at him with a dim expression. A few long moments later, he opened his mouth and said in an even voice, Verne said, 3 more people have vanished. 3 more people gone, and 0 new clues were found. This time, the vanished weren't awakened. One was a mundane soldier, one was a scientist, and one was a member of the civilian support staff. They didn't have anything particular in common. No thread that connected them together or to the first victim. All 3 vanished from different locations, and had been last seen at different times. Sunny and Verne silently investigated their living quarters, the areas they had been known to frequent in the settlement, and their last known locations. They didn't find anything. In the process, both of them grew more and more somber. At some point, Sunny threw a suspicious look at the other master. What did he really know about Verne? Verne was a local of Antarctica, a career serviceman with a stellar record, a competent fighter, and a leader that was loved and respected by his men. His aspect centered around heat transference and physical augmentation, not exactly something that could have been used to dispose of bodies. But then again, who said that it had to be done with an aspect ability? Almost at the same time, Verne suddenly glanced at Sunny with his usual stoic expression. His eyes, however, were cold and heavy.
I heard that you've a spatial storage memory.
Sunny looked at him darkly. Sunny retorted, "So what if I do?" Verne held his gaze for a few long moments, then turned away with a sigh. Verne muttered, "This isn't good." Sunny had to agree. If the two of them were already paranoid enough to suspect each other, then the rest of the installation residents had to really be on edge. A bit of vigilance was never a bad thing, but with how pressured people already felt, one additional burden could become a spark that had the potential to cause a violent explosion. He sighed.
We have to be ready to implement measures.
Verne gave him a sideways glance. Sunny asked, "What kind of measures?" Sunny stared at him calmly, or coldly even. He was so tired. Sunny replied, "Whatever kind that works." He was so tired. The other master remained silent for a while.
I am confident in my people, even exhausted and sleep-deprived. They'll remain disciplined. The civilians, however, that might be a challenge. However, the best way to resolve this issue is to prevent it from happening in the first place. For that, we need to understand what's going on and stop more people from disappearing.
Sunny lingered for a few moments. Eventually, he shrugged. Sunny murmured, "Yeah, let's hope that we will." With that, they moved to the next item on the agenda, interviewing the witnesses. Perhaps witnesses was the wrong word this time. All 3 victims were mundanes. That meant that they had been assigned a partner by the updated safety protocols that Verne had established. They hadn't been supposed to remain alone at any point, not to mention long enough to vanish without a trace. And yet, they had. The interviews didn't reveal anything substantial. The mutual responsibility partners of the 3 victims reported the same thing. The vanished had been with them throughout the day, but at some point disappeared, completely unnoticed. The scientist and the staff member had been gone by the time their partners woke up, and the soldier seemed to have vanished while his comrade turned away to concentrate on servicing one of the wall turrets. It was after the remaining soldier had reported his partner's absence that the fact that 2 more people were missing was discovered. None of the 3 victims had been acting strangely or revealed any discomfort prior to their vanishing. There was simply nothing for Sunny and Verne to catch. No thread they could pull to unravel the whole mystery. Their moods grew darker and darker. While they were interviewing the witnesses, there were 2 deaths inside the settlement. One was a scientist that had reported symptoms of being infected by the spell a day prior, was confined to a secure room in the installation's medical center, and quietly passed away in her sleep. Several awakened monitoring the situation, dispatched the nightmare creature that the dead scientist had turned into, preventing the repeat of the safe room massacre. The other was a staff member that had been so afraid to fall asleep that he stole a batch of military stimulants from the same medical center. Inevitably, these stimulants, developed for awakened soldiers, had put too much strain on his body. The man collapsed and swiftly died of acute heart failure in front of dozens of frightened civilians. Sunny and Verne received the report about the deaths right after finishing the fruitless interviews. A heavy silence settled in the empty room, where only the 2 of them remained. Eventually, Verne gritted his teeth.
This is all a bit suffocating, isn't it?
The local master looked weary, but still composed and resolute. Sunny leaned back on his chair, tiredly thinking of the soft bed that was waiting for him inside the Rhino.
Yes, there are very few things that are more suffocating than powerlessness. You get used to it, though.
Verne grimaced.
If the 2 of us feel powerless, then how do the rest of them feel?
He was quiet for a bit and then asked,
3 days, that's when the ship will arrive, right?
Sunny silently shook his head.
Don't expect the Ariadne to arrive at the earliest opportunity. Naval navigation isn't easy. It's better to plan for the worst.
Soon, Verne made an announcement reiterating the importance of the updated safety measures and ordering all personnel at Low 49 to follow them to the letter, as well as introducing stricter measures of mutual responsibility. People were forced to always stay in groups, mark their comings and goings in special ledgers, share cramped living quarters, and were confined to areas of the settlement that had to do with their direct responsibilities. They couldn't even visit the bathroom on their own. More soldiers had to leave their posts on the walls of the fortress to saturate the patrol schedule and stand guard inside the buildings. Every awakened with an aspect suitable for scouting was put to work monitoring the interior of the settlement. Verne himself oversaw what little of the observation system was still functioning. Sunny's shadows kept watch at key points of Low 49, but despite all that, throughout the next day, 6 more people went missing. 6 people vanished. There were still no traces. It seemed that the killer, whoever or whatever the killer was, didn't care if the person was alone or in a group. The mutual responsibility system wasn't working. Everyone was scared. The next day, 7 people vanished. 4 of them were experienced awakened. Some of the best soldiers Verne had, the other 3 were scientists. On the same day, 2 more mundanes succumbed to the spell. One of them died and was eliminated. The other was still struggling somewhere out there. In the first nightmare, perhaps that person would become a sleeper soon. A day after that, 12 people vanished. No clues were found, and fear continued to spread through the facility like a plague. It had yet to transform into panic, but the residents of Low 49 were starting to grow restless, trapped in the suffocating atmosphere of dread, exhaustion, and doubt. Sunny really wanted to sleep. Then, the day that the Ariadne could have arrived came. People were uplifted a little by the excitement, but Sunny didn't share in their enthusiasm. He expected the rescue to reach them no sooner than after another week. A lot of things could happen in a week. The Ariadne didn't arrive, but a horde of nightmare creatures appeared instead, descending from the mountains. It seemed that things weren't going well up north, considering that such a large swarm of abominations had been allowed to assemble and travel freely. What was the army even doing? Isolated at the edge of the world, they had no way of knowing. The battle was long and fierce, but ended in a decisive victory. The tired soldiers retreated back into the fortress without even bothering to burn the corpses. They would be covered by the snow soon. Anyway, everyone felt the growing fatigue. The mundane person who had been making their way through the first nightmare woke up as a sleeper. The next day, that sleeper disappeared, along with 14 more people. The scavenger gate released a new wave of abominations. There were just a handful of them. So Sunny slaughtered the nightmare creatures himself before anyone else had time to arrive. On his way back, he noticed that many of the carcasses laying under a thin veil of fresh snow seemed to be missing large chunks of flesh. Sunny was too tired to care.
I should sleep. There's nothing preventing me from sleeping. In fact, it's detrimental to remain awake. I'll think better if I rest.
But that wasn't true. Despite his exhaustion, Sunny's mind seemed to only become sharper. He had lost a bit of situational awareness and reaction speed, but was now able to enter a state of being laser-focused on something in exchange. He was also extremely calm, almost as if lacking the energy to feel anxious or agitated. His mind was clear. That evening, Sunny was standing on the southern wall of the fortress, looking at the undulating black ocean. The cold waves rustled as they washed over the stone expanse of the beach, carrying pieces of ice. The wind was howling, and the full moon shone in the dark sky, surrounded by an ethereal scarlet aurora. The Ariadne was somewhere out there, illuminated by the same moon. After some time, a lumbering figure climbed the wall and approached him. Dorn looked as tired as the rest of them. However, the giant man seemed to be holding up comparatively well. Sunny turned and looked at him.
Captain, I've an idea. Can I share it?
He nodded silently. Dorn hesitated for a few moments, and then said,
Well, it's about the bodies, and by now we have explored every millimeter of this facility. We have searched the coastal plain extensively. Too, you probably swept it all countless times, and yet we didn't find even a single drop of blood. It seems that we have searched everywhere, but actually there's one place where we didn't look. Since the bodies aren't anywhere else, they had to be in that place, in the water. That's the only logical conclusion.
The large man leaned on the lip of the wall. The black waves continued to sway, indifferent to his words. The unfathomable ocean remained the unchanged. Sunny was silent for a while, and then nodded.
Yeah, that's my thinking too, so I'll be keeping a close eye on the beach.
Somewhere in the base, one of his shadows was on its usual patrol, gliding past a personnel lounge. It noticed Luster, who was sitting on a couch with a glassy look in his eyes. The young man seemed to be on the verge of dozing off. The shadow momentarily turned tangible and looked at him with disdainful reproach. Then, it slapped him across the face and disappeared. Luster jumped to his feet and looked around in shock.
Who and what? Ouch, it hurts.
Back on the wall, a pale smile appeared on Sunny's face.
Dorn, that mutual responsibility protocol. You guys start following it, too. Make pairs and watch each other.
Dorn nodded, lingered for a few moments, and then left. Sunny continued staring at the ocean.
This doesn't make sense. Even if the killer disposes of the bodies by throwing them into the water, someone would have noticed something. Dozens of people vanished already. All of it's very strange.
While he was thinking, 2 more people ascended the wall. One of them was an awakened soldier, and the other one was a scientist. Sunny turned around and looked at them with a confused look on his face, since he was standing close to the latter. The newcomers had no choice but to bump into him. Sunny remained motionless for a few seconds, then took a step back to make way. The awakened and the scientist calmly approached the lip of the wall, climbed over it, and jumped down. One of them landed well, but the other hit the rocks and silently fell. A disturbing sound of breaking bones could be heard, carried by the wind. Sunny rubbed his face and continued to study the ocean. The awakened walked toward the waves, while the scientist crawled. Because of that, the freezing water reached his knees, then his waist, then his chest. Finally, the awakened disappeared beneath the undulating black surface and drowned at that time. The scientist had crawled far enough to reach the edge of the water. His figure silently vanished into the cold waves. As well, nothing remained of the two. Standing atop the wall, Sunny calmly looked at the ocean.
What was I thinking about? Ah, yes, it's strange that no one had seen anything. How do the bodies get dumped into the ocean without anyone noticing?
He didn't know. Maybe his theory was wrong and the killer hadn't been using the water to hide the corpses. The water, it surely looked inviting. Suddenly, Sunny felt a strange urge to go for a swim. A moment later, he shivered.
A swim? What am I, crazy? who swims in the freezing water during the winter in Antarctica of all places.
Shaking his head, Sunny continued to stand watch above the beach. He hadn't seen anything suspicious yet, but if he remained vigilant, he would surely discover something soon. Sunny remained on the southern wall for 2 days, silently staring at the ocean. In the meantime, 36 people vanished. Some of them were awakened, and some of them were mundane, despite safety measures growing more and more draconian. Verne had failed to prevent the disappearances. It was all futile and deeply, eerily frightening. The stern master came to talk to Sunny at some point, but left more frustrated than he had been before. The fortress withstood another attack from a transient swarm of nightmare creatures. Just like the previous one, it came from the north. This time, Sunny didn't participate in the battle, choosing instead to remain where he was. There were a few casualties. The awakened soldiers were all exhausted after remaining awake for more than a week. The stimulant patches were gradually losing their effectiveness. The mundane soldiers were better rested, but much more disturbed. They were all wary of the nightmare spell. The civilians were both exhausted and afraid. They hadn't been trained to withstand this kind of stress, and the seemingly unknowable nature of the vanishings was pushing them to the verge of panic. If not for the sense of order established and enforced by Verne's protocols and the hope of the Ariadne's nearing arrival, they would have come completely undone by now. The rescue ship was supposed to arrive in 3 or 4 days. Sunny silently looked at the water, deep in thought. Hearing light steps, he glanced sideways and saw Bate, who was shivering in the cold as she approached him.
Hey, Master Sunless.
He frowned. Bate said again more quietly, "Hey." The young woman looked at him silently for a while, then gritted her teeth.
What are you doing? You've been stuck on this wall for days. You even ignored the last attack.
Sunny tilted his head a little when he responded. His voice sounded a bit strange.
I am investigating.
Beth stared at him in disbelief.
You are doing nothing and expect me to believe that it's all a part of the investigation. Please, both you and Verne have turned out to be completely useless. So many people are gone, and the two of you failed to produce even a tiny clue.
At that moment, another person appeared on the wall. It was a mature woman in a white lab coat, with a tranquil expression on her face. Both of them moved to let her pass, not paying any attention as the woman silently climbed over the lip and jumped down. The undulating darkness of the ocean reflected in her eyes. Sunny frowned slightly at the sound of a body hitting the rocks down below and shook his head, instantly forgetting about it. He muttered that she could believe what she wanted. Bate glowered at him for a bit, then sighed and turned away.
It doesn't matter, anyway. We just need to persevere for a few more days until help arrives, but you promised to protect the professor, and yet you left him alone to sit on this wall. That's unacceptable.
Gods, how devoted can she be? Professor this, professor that, and can't that girl think about herself for once? She's in danger, too.
He rolled his eyes.
Who says I left him alone? Bate, I've been watching Professor Obel and you 24 hours a day, every day, since this whole mess started.
She blinked.
What and how?
Sunny scoffed.
My first specialty is scouting. Wherever my shadows go, my gaze follows. One of them had been keeping an eye on the professor, so how do you think I was able to get to the safe room so fast when you were attacked?
Beth looked at him for a bit, then, suddenly, her cheeks turned red.
T 24 hours a day. What kind of a creep?
Sunny palmed his face.
Get over yourself. Do you think I've time to spy on mundane girls while all this crap is going on? The point is, Professor Obel is as safe as I can make him.
At that point, another person climbed to the top of the wall and jumped down. Neither of them spared them a single look. Although Sunny seemed to shiver a little, Bate opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. After a long pause, she finally forced out a few words.
Well, it's fine. I guess I'll be going then.
Sunny nodded and agreed.
It's all right.
Then he suddenly called out to her.
Do you know my soldiers? There's a big guy called Dorn, can you ask him to come here?
Not waiting for a response, he turned around and headed in the direction of the security center. As Sunny walked through the settlement, many people looked at him. Some of them seemed frightened. Some of them seemed angry. Some were simply numb. Everyone was exhausted. Arriving at the security center, Sunny found Verne and Professor Obel sitting in silence with dark, tired expressions on their faces. The old man looked even more fragile and ancient than usual. Sunny placed the memory storage on the table in front of them. Verne stared at it for a moment, then looked up.
We're done here, let's go.
Not waiting for a response, he turned around and headed in the direction of the security center. As Sunny walked through the settlement, many people looked at him. Some of them seemed frightened. Some of them seemed angry. Some were simply numb. Everyone was exhausted. Arriving at the security center, Sunny found Verne and Professor Obel sitting in silence with dark, tired expressions on their faces. The old man looked even more fragile and ancient than usual. Sunny placed the memory storage on the table in front of them. Verne stared at it for a moment, then looked up.
Why are you here?
Sunny sat down and rubbed his hands together to warm them. A dark, ominous smile appeared on his lips.
My investigation is complete. I know why people are vanishing.
Verne and Professor Obel were suddenly very focused on his words. Even Dorn, who had spent the last 2 days on the wall with Sunny, seemed to shake off his fatigue and paid rapt attention to what his captain had to say. Sunny shut his eyes for a moment.
When the first victim vanished, I said that there were only 3 possibilities: that he had deserted, that he had been killed by another human, and that a nightmare creature had infiltrated the facility. Well, I was wrong. None of these theories were correct. The third one was the closest to the truth, though.
He sighed.
There's indeed a nightmare creature, only it's not inside the fortress.
Verne frowned, looking at him with dark intensity. He asked,
What do you mean?
Sunny lingered for a bit before answering.
The answer is almost obvious when you consider 2 things and then put them together. First, the bodies. People don't just vanish without a trace, and yet we failed to find anything, not at Low 49 and not on the coastal plain beyond the wall. So, the most obvious answer is that the bodies are being taken to somewhere where we can't find them, into the water. There's a whole ocean out there, after all.
Verne wanted to say something, but remained silent at the end, waiting for Sunny to continue. Sunny nodded.
The second thing is the call. Its strength had a qualitative change on the day we fought the scavengers. Too drastic of a change, really, to be produced by a single gate, especially one as unimpressive as that. I remember being convinced that there were 2, at least. Before exploring the plain and finding just one, I even said that we were lucky.
He stared at them for a moment and then shook his head.
However, we weren't lucky, and there was, indeed, another gate, one more powerful than the scavenger gate that we cleared. We just didn't find it.
Professor Obel didn't seem to follow his reasoning. That was only to be expected. Considering that the old man didn't experience the call himself, Verne, however, finally, a hint of understanding appeared on his face.
A second gate in water. You think that there's another gate that opened underwater?
Sunny nodded.
I am more or less convinced that there's, and that's the reason why people are vanishing.
Verne shook his head.
That doesn't entirely explain it all. Yes, we have pulled a lot of soldiers off the walls to augment internal patrols, but the ocean is still being watched. Nothing would have been able to crawl from beneath the waves, grab people inside the facility, and drag them back into the water unnoticed.
Sunny smiled darkly.
I was just about to get to that.
He rubbed his eyes tiredly.
We are all under a mind hex. That's why no one noticed anything.
Professor Obel, Verne, and Dorn looked at him with confusion. Finally, the old man asked,
Master Sunless, do you perhaps have a piece of evidence to substantiate your theory?
Sunny simply shook his head.
No, but that's exactly the point. It's the absence of evidence that proves my theory. No matter how elusive, devious, and powerful a nightmare creature is, we should have found some kind of clue by now. Although security equipment of the facility barely works because of the interference, the cameras would have captured something. The strict protocols and mutual responsibility system Verne had implemented would have produced some result. My shadows would have found some traces, but nothing of the sort happened, which is nothing short of impossible. There's a big negative space in the place where all the results should have been. However, we can infer certain things from that negative space itself.
A dark expression appeared on his face.
What I'm trying to say is that there are, in fact, traces. We were just rendered incapable of comprehending them. Something like that had already happened to me once. Back then, I spent an entire month being mesmerized by an insidious nightmare creature. However, I was utterly oblivious to its influence. Simply for the fact the first thing that the hex did was take away my ability to become aware of its existence. I am convinced that something like that's happening to all of us right now, too.
Sunny looked at Verne and Professor Obel somberly.
There's a powerful gate below the surface of the water, somewhere in the vicinity of this facility. The gate brought a dreadful nightmare creature into the waking world, and that creature is using mind manipulation to both lure people into its maw and make others incapable of stopping it.
An uncomfortable silence settled in the security center. Professor Obel seemed resigned, but Verne, on the contrary, was suddenly energized.
If that's true, then we just have to kill that abomination, and then everything will be resolved.
There was hope and resolve in his eyes. For a warrior, having a clear enemy to fight was familiar territory. With a sigh, Sunny shook his head.
No, we won't be able to kill that nightmare creature.
Verne scowled and demanded.
What and why?
Sunny pointed at the bleak steel of the undying chain, which he had been wearing ever since people started disappearing.
Because this is a transcendent armor of the third tier, one of its enchantments provides the wearer with a high degree of protection against mind attacks, and yet I wasn't spared from the effects of the mind hex at all. You know what that means.
Verne's face suddenly grew dim.
That the nightmare creature's attack is more powerful than your armor's defenses.
Sunny nodded.
Indeed, which would make it of the corrupted rank, at least. My bet would be that it's a corrupted terror. Neither of us is its match, especially not in the water. We can't kill it.
At that moment, Professor Obel finally spoke.
So then, what should we do?
Sunny remained silent for a while, looking at the memory storage device that lay on the table in front of him. Finally, he shifted slightly and said,
First, we break the mind hex.
Sunny's plan was rather simple, since the mental protection granted by the undying chain wasn't enough to break through the mind hex of the unknown horror. He just had to get better defenses. Of course, he could have summoned Saint, who was completely immune to that kind of attack, if he had no choice but to fight the abomination, which Sunny suspected to be a corrupted terror. He would do exactly that, but at this point. He was simply trying to understand what exactly was happening, and how, considering that Saint wouldn't be able to communicate what she saw, he had to try breaking through the hex himself. First, several minutes later, Verne summoned the officers of his awakened force, and then sent them away with a simple task: to get every memory that could offer at least some form of protection against mind attacks to Sunny. Considering that there were still around 90 awakened soldiers at the facility, at least a couple of them had to have something like that in their arsenal. Soon, Sunny found himself in possession of several loaned memories. He was wearing the undying chain, which was his best tool to solve this situation. There was a new charm hanging around his neck, a strangely mercurial cloak on his back, and a flint dagger with a handle made out of weathered bone in his hand. The dagger came from Verne itself, so it was especially powerful. There were many people in the security center now, including Verne, Professor Obel, and Bate, all 6 of his soldiers, and several sleep-deprived awakened officers. Sunny was sitting in front of a screen, holding the memory storage device, taking a deep breath. He wrapped all 4 of his shadows around the undying chain and felt its bleak steel become stronger, more durable, and more powerful. Then, he inserted the memory device into the socket of the terminal and accessed the recording stored on it. Everyone watched the video feed of the undulating ocean with a morbid sense of curiosity. However, none of the people present in the security center noticed anything special about the recording. After a while, Bates said in a tentative tone,
I don't see anything.
However, when she looked at Sunny, there was a grim expression on his pale, tired face because, unlike everyone else, Sunny was seeing things that he had been unable to notice earlier. To him, the recording showed an immensely macabre reality. The things he saw on the screen left him disturbed, shaken, and dismayed. He breathed a quiet curse.
Damnation.
As the recording went on, replaying the shifting landscape of the lightless beach from the past 2 days at enhanced speed, Sunny slowed it down to a crawl several times, seemingly for no apparent reason. Every time, his expression turned more and more ugly. He had known, of course, to expect something like that. However, watching himself nonchalantly make way for the mesmerized victims, only to forget about their existence a moment later, was deeply unsettling. Sunny had witnessed dozens of people being swallowed by the cold waves, and yet, this was the first time his consciousness managed to become aware of that fact. As it did, the hex was broken, and suddenly, all the memories that had been suppressed before flooded his mind. Sunny shuddered and whispered.
Gods.
Noticing his strong reaction, Verne leaned forward.
What's it? What do you see? And what kind of nightmare creature is it? How does it capture people from within the facility?
Sunny lingered for a moment and then stopped the playback with a trembling hand. He stared at it in confusion and made a fist, causing the tremors to stop. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh.
I was right, mostly. There's indeed a mind hex affecting everyone in this fortress. It makes us indifferent and unaware of the victims and the traces left behind by them. However, I didn't see the creature itself. It never appeared. The victims, they just walked into the ocean themselves and vanished, some right in front of our eyes. It seems that the bastard is somehow controlling them to come to it, and us to be blind to their passing.
Verne gritted his teeth.
And there has to be a way to stop it.
Sunny hesitated for a long time.
In my experience, the only way to deal with a creature like that's to run away from it while we can.
The other master shook his head with a resentful expression. That resentment wasn't aimed at Sunny. However, instead, it was aimed at the dreadful being that hid beneath the waves, the chain of nightmares, and the sorry state of the waking world in general.
Leaving Low 49 now would be no different from suicide. We won't make it across hundreds of kilometers of rough terrain alive, not with hordes of nightmare creatures prowling this region of the Antarctic center seemingly unopposed. With no intelligence about the state of the territory and cut off from army command.
His eyes grew cold.
We have to remain here and wait for the Ariadne to arrive. It should be here in 2 days, or if not soon enough, we can survive this abomination for 2 days.
Sunny looked at him for a while, thinking, although remaining this close to a potential corrupted terror made him extremely uneasy. He had to admit that what Verne had said was reasonable. The Ariadne, indeed, was their best chance. He sighed.
So, what do you propose we do in the meantime? Just let the bastard continue gobbling up humans.
Verne crossed his arms and frowned.
No, now that we know what's happening, we can prevent more people from vanishing.
Sunny raised his eyebrow.
And how do you propose we do that?
The other master looked at him, deep in thought. After a few moments, he said calmly,
Well, someone just has to prevent the victims from jumping into the ocean, right?
A pale smile appeared on Sunny's face. Somehow, he already knew who was going to get that job. Sunny was the only one who could prevent more people from silently walking into the cold ocean, even if he returned the borrowed memories and gave the undying chain to someone else. The other person wouldn't be able to enjoy the augmentation of the four shadows. So, the mind hex would remain unbroken. If there was one good thing about the situation, it was that after Sunny had rid himself of the hex, he didn't need to keep up his mental defenses at such a high level anymore. It was as though he was now inoculated against the unknown creature's influence, at least for now. He returned the charm, the mercurial cloak, and the flint dagger to their owners. One shadow continued to follow Professor Obel, while the other three remained wrapped around the undying chain, just in case. After that, everyone got to work. although Sunny was the only person who could perceive the mesmerized. It didn't mean that nobody else could help prevent more people from vanishing. Now that Verne knew what they were dealing with exactly, he could tune the safety protocols of the fortress to make it harder for the enemy to snatch victims away. Soldiers received new instructions, while all non-essential personnel were confined to their living quarters. If they couldn't leave, they would most likely be unable to reach the water. After all, Sunny, meanwhile, walking onto the dark beach, he sighed, then placed an intricate wooden chair at the very edge of the rustling waves and sat down with his back to the ocean, facing the wall of the fortress. Sunny shivered in the cold wind for a few moments, leaned back, and leisurely crossed his legs.
Oh, it's a bit chilly.
The world was dark, and the only sounds surrounding him were the howling of the wind and the incessant murmur of the waves. Sitting with his back to the ocean wasn't pleasant, especially with a corrupted terror hiding somewhere beneath its lightless surface. The only thing that made Sunny feel better was the unmoving silhouette of Saint, who was hidden in the shadow of the wall with Morgan's warbow in her hands. Even then, Sunny had a lot to worry about. Would he really be able to stop people from reaching the water? Would they resist, or would they allow themselves to be brought back inside L049? Most importantly, what would the terror do if its source of sustenance was suddenly cut off? Somehow, Sunny doubted that the creature was going to just leave them be. He just had to hope that the rescue ship would arrive before the eventual retaliation, and take them away before the creature could cast its hex on the crew. As well, with a sigh, Sunny released his shadows and sent them forward. The shadows climbed the wall and separated, assuming watching positions in 3 different spots. Then, all he could do was wait and listen to the rustle of the waves behind him. A minute passed, then another, then a few more. Sunny opened a thermos he had brought with him and poured himself a cup of fragrant coffee, sipping it in the bitter cold. He continued to wait and pretend that the ocean didn't concern him at all. After about an hour, a human figure finally appeared on the wall. Sunny slapped himself in the face to chase away sleepiness, then put the thermos down and stood up. One step through the shadows brought him to the mesmerized person. The man, he knew that man. It was one of the awakened officers in charge of the local garrison. This soldier had usually been cheerful and energetic, even after staying awake for close to 2 weeks. But now, there was a blank, empty expression on his face and no light in his hollow eyes. Sunny stood between the slowly walking awakened and the lip of the wall. This time, he didn't step aside to make way. Instead, he hesitated for a moment, then put his hand on the soldier's shoulder, stopping him. The man made a few more awkward steps, not realizing that he was walking in place. Then, he ceased moving and slowly turned his head, staring at Sunny with calm, glassy eyes. Sunny muttered,
Damn, oh that's creepy.
Sunny opened his mouth to say something, but at that moment, a strong blow sent him flying back, crashing into the rampart. He broke through it and tumbled off the wall, landing on the rocks far below in an undignified heap.
Largs, what the hell?
The strike was much stronger than anything a mere awakened should have been able to deliver, even without augmenting his body with the shadows. Sunny was a master. He also had 4 cores and a sea of essence at his disposal. Why was the mesmerized officer so strong? Cursing, he slowly rose from the ground. At the same time, the awakened landed on the rocks a few steps away from him, swayed a little, and continued marching toward the dark waves. Since Sunny wasn't blocking his path anymore, the soldier didn't pay him any more attention. Sunny growled,
Not so fast, you damned fool.
creating a long chain out of the shadows. Sunny made a loop out of it and tossed it forward, ensnaring the mesmerized man, taking the unexpected strength that the soldier had shown into account. He added another chain for good measure and grinned weakly.
Just like the good old times.
The memory of throwing a chain loop at the Mountain King was still vivid and fresh in his mind, making sure that Verne's officer was immobilized. Sunny dragged him back and then scaled the wall. A few minutes later, slightly out of breath, he reached the old observatory and walked inside. There, the first few containment units had already been built, and a working crew was hurriedly creating more. They glanced at Sunny with confusion, but then quickly lost interest. Distracted by the mind hex, ignoring the workers, Sunny walked to the nearest unit, threw the mesmerized officer inside and locked the door, even for an awakened. Escaping from a prison like that wasn't supposed to be possible. A moment later, several furious strikes landed on the walls of the containment cell from inside, making it shudder. However, in the end, the sturdy construction held, realizing that he wouldn't be able to break free. The mesmerized soldier walked to the corner that was the closest to the ocean, pressed against it, and froze. He just stood there, unmoving like a statue, not doing anything. Sunny slowly exhaled and remarked,
"Well, that's not bad."
He had been afraid that the mesmerized would bang their heads against the walls of their cages, attempting to reach the ocean even if it wasn't possible. Now that he wasn't holding the soldier, the workers finally noticed his presence. They stared at Sunny with surprised eyes. He blinked a couple of times, then smiled.
"Carry on, I am just passing by."
At that moment, his shadows noticed another human climbing onto the wall. Sunny sighed, lingered for a moment, and then stepped through the shadows once again. Sunny felt like he was going insane. He was tired, sleep-deprived, and cold. He was stuck in a fortress on a remote continent, which had been built around an eerie, abandoned observatory. The fortress was being besieged by an unknown horror from the depths, and he was the only person who had managed to escape from the horror's hex. The strangest thing about all that, however, was that Sunny was sometimes invisible. Every time he subdued and dragged one of the victims to the containment facility built inside the old observatory, everyone in the settlement acted as though he didn't exist. No, not exactly invisible. People were able to observe him, but the fact of his existence seemed to flow out of their consciousness almost immediately after being registered there. As long as Sunny was in the presence of one of the mesmerized victims, the residents of Low 49 looked at him, frowned, and then went about their business, instantly forgetting what they had seen. It was really unnerving. In his exhausted state, Sunny felt a deep and irrational fear that if this went on, he would be forgotten by everyone, forever. He wondered if that was how the demon of oblivion had felt. Luckily, the bizarre effect seemed to only last for as long as Sunny was transporting prisoners to their cells, as soon as he placed them in the containment units. His existence was made normal once again. Well, as far as his existence could be called normal to begin with on the first day of his catcher duty. Sunny had fought, subdued, and imprisoned 29 people. His muscles were sore, and his armor was wet from being close to the water for so long, despite his efforts. And to his relief, the terror hadn't reacted to the sudden obstacle that appeared in the path of its satiation. At least not yet. Saint continued to hide in the shadow of the tall wall of the fortress, monitoring the deep, dark, cold waters of the ocean. At midnight, Sunny reported the results of his effort to Verne. They walked over to the observatory together, where the other master remained silent for a long time.
Are you telling me that there are people in these cells?
Sunny struggled with a yawn, failed to suppress it, and then nodded. He answered.
"Yes, around 30 of them."
Verne stared at the cells with a deep frown for a minute or two, then shook his head in bewilderment.
Strange, even though I know that they're there, I can't see anything. To me, the cells seem empty.
Sunny was a bit late to react.
"Oh, believe me, they're there. They just stand near the southern side of their units and do nothing. At least they're staring at the walls and not at us. That would be really creepy."
Verne looked at him with dark amusement.
I think this situation is sufficiently creepy as it's.
Then, he turned away from the cells and asked in a somber tone,
Any change in the terror's behavior?
Sunny shook his head.
"No, at least not that I've noticed."
Verne remained silent for a moment and sighed.
Good, continue then. The Ariadne should be arriving soon, so we just have to endure a little bit longer.
Just like that, Sunny continued his eerie task. He waited by the water, caught the people trying to drown themselves in the ocean, and locked them up in cells while suffering from being invisible.
Damn cold.
He had long summoned the memory of ice and continuously fed it with essence to save himself from the chilling wind. Just like that, Another day passed. During that day, Sunny rescued 35 people from being devoured by the waves. His skill of making chains out of shadows improved by a lot. A few minutes before midnight, Sunny was sitting on his chair with an empty thermos in his hand and stared at the sky. Today, there was no moon and no aurora. Only the stars remained, shining softly up above.
The waves sound differently today.
He rubbed his face, then turned around and stared at the undulating black surface of the ocean with intense distrust. He muttered,
40, it's accelerating.
Just then, something seemed to change about the world. Sunny frowned, but before he could do anything, another figure appeared on the wall, forcing a long sigh to escape from his lips. He stood up, ready to step through the shadows and subdue the 40th victim. But there was something strange about the figure. Instead of moving toward the edge of the wall like the rest of them, it stopped and raised a hand, as if signaling to him. It was Quentin. Sunny conserved his essence by jogging forward, then lowering his body slightly and mounting the wall with one inhumanly high jump. He landed on the concrete surface of the rampart, walked a few steps, and looked at Quentin with a deep frown. He demanded,
What happened?
The chivalrous healer smiled, excitement shining in his eyes.
Captain, the observatory you need to see.
Without wasting any time, Sunny jumped down to the roof of the nearby building, and then hurried toward the white dome at the center of the settlement. Walking inside, he instantly heard a swarm of confused, frightened, and angry voices, and someone nearby cried out, asking what had happened and where they were. He stared, dumbfounded. These voices were coming from within the cells. They belonged to the victims he had imprisoned, somehow. They seemed to have shrugged off the mind hex and regained their awareness. And it wasn't just them. Sunny turned his head and looked at the maintenance workers that were in charge of keeping the containment units secure. They were all speaking with excitement and glancing at the cells with relieved faces. They heard the victims, too, which meant that the hex wasn't affecting them anymore, either, despite the happy circumstances. Sunny was suddenly overwhelmed by a deep, cold, urgent feeling of unease. It grasped his heart and remained there, growing slightly stronger with each second. He shivered.
What's going on?
After Sunny had broken through the mind hex and spent 2 days rescuing the mesmerized people, saving dozens of lives, the horror hiding in the cold black waves seemed to have left the vicinity of Low 49. The victims had regained their senses, and every person in the settlement was able to see and hear them clearly once again. In the next few hours, no one showed any sign of being under the influence of the hex. The vanishing stopped. The Ariadne was supposed to arrive soon. The exhausted, frightened, and shaken inhabitants of the fortress were tentatively starting to unwind. Their fragile hope bloomed and blossomed. However, the person most responsible for the positive change, Sunny, didn't feel any of their cheer or relief. On the contrary, with each passing minute, his unease and sense of foreboding only grew stronger. He didn't like what was happening. Not at all, walking through the snowy streets of the settlement. Sunny studied the lively faces of patrolling soldiers with a troubled expression on his own. It was dark and somber.
It doesn't make sense. None of it makes any sense.
Approaching the security center, he placed his hand on the panel of a sophisticated biometric lock. The sensor was supposed to initiate a thorough scan, but as seconds passed, nothing seemed to happen. The damn thing was on the fritz. Sunny stared at it for a moment, then sighed and banged on the heavy alloy door with his fist. Soon, it was manually unlocked from the inside by a sleepy soldier, who then allowed Sunny in, walking inside the security center. Sunny dusted snow off his shoulders, looked around, and headed toward Verne. He asked,
What's the situation?
Verne sent one of his officers off with a list of orders, then looked at his younger colleague and shrugged.
Nothing changed. The terror, or whatever that abomination was, seems to have truly moved on.
Sunny gritted his teeth.
When has a nightmare creature ever moved on? You are deluding yourself.
The older master frowned.
We can't know for sure, of course, but the disappearance of the hex speaks for itself. Don't sell yourself short. Although creatures capable of mind manipulation are exceedingly dangerous, They often lack direct means of launching an effective attack. Maybe it decided to search for easier prey after you proved capable of dismantling its mental attack.
Sunny stared at him for a bit, then shook his head.
A corrupted terror is a corrupted terror. We probably haven't seen even a fraction of its power yet, so why would it simply give up and leave?
Verne tiredly rubbed his face and sighed.
Do take into account that the creature's rank and class are only your conjecture. We don't really know how powerful it actually was. In any case, how else do you explain the fact that the hex is gone and no one is vanishing anymore?
Sunny hesitated for a moment.
Maybe it decided to change tactics. Maybe it's gathering power for a singular, overwhelming attack. Maybe it just enjoys toying with its prey. Who the hell knows?
His counterpart looked away with a somber expression.
All right, but what do you want me to do? It's not like I've relaxed the security measures. We are still on high alert and prepared for battle. We are still keeping the civilians locked up and concentrating our defenses on the southern wall. I don't see what other contingencies are there to prepare.
Sunny let out a frustrated sigh.
All I am saying is that it's not a good time to become complacent. On the contrary, we must be preparing for a rapid escalation of the crisis.
Verne stared at him blankly for a few seconds.
And all I am saying is that we are already doing everything we can, no matter how small. The possibility that you are right still exists, so we must. That's my position as the officer responsible for the safety of every person inside this facility. But personally, I think that exhaustion and paranoia are getting the better of you. Sunless, it's been hard on all of us.
Sunny remained silent for a bit, then said in a subdued voice.
My paranoia has never led me astray, though.
With that, he winced and left.
Maybe I'm really wrong this time. Even if I am not, Verne is right. What else are we supposed to do? Until the damned ship arrives, there's not much more we can prepare.
But why did he feel so disturbed? Why was his sense of unease so urgent? Walking out of the security center, Sunny stood in place for a while with a dark expression on his face. After some time, he noticed Luster loitering around and called him over. Luster answered.
Oh yes, you wanted something, Captain.
Sunny lingered for a moment, then nodded.
Yeah, gather the others and tell them to stick close to the Rhino. Also, make sure that it's ready to move, in case we need to get the hell out of this damned place in a hurry.
Luster blinked a couple of times, looking at him with a startled expression. Then he gulped.
Understood, sir. I'll go do that then.
Letting the young man go, Sunny turned south and stared at the distant wall for a bit. Frowning, he then headed toward it. The beach was cold and shrouded in darkness. Like always, the black waves continued their eternal, fruitless assault on the shore. They came and went with a wide, reverberating rustle, making it seem as though the whole ocean was breathing. His chair was still standing at the edge of the water, with an empty thermos laying on the stones nearby. Descending from the wall, Sunny slowly walked toward the water and stopped just outside its reach, staring at the vast undulating expanse of the cold ocean with a deep scowl. His tired eyes were hidden in shadows. Looking at the waves, he whispered,
Where are you, bastard? What are you planning?
Of course, the ocean remained silent. There was no response. Sunny stood at the edge of the water for a while, looking at the ocean with a wary expression on his face. He murmured,
Funny.
Back when he had first developed the habit of climbing the southern wall of the fortress, he stared at the ocean in hopes of witnessing the fearsome silhouette of the mighty battleship appearing from the darkness. But now that the Ariadne was about to arrive, his thoughts were far away. Eventually, Sunny sighed and finally dismissed his chair, planning to return into the warmth of the settlement. However, just before he turned away from the dark water, something attracted his attention. A subtle gleam a few steps further down the shore, revealed from beneath the retreating waves, as though bleak starlight was reflecting from a small piece of glass. Sunny hesitated for a few moments, then walked a meter or two forward, stopping at the spot where he had spotted the gleaming object. A new wave rushed in, licking his armored boots. He had to wait for it to crawl back before kneeling and taking a closer look at the wet rocks. There, between them, something glistened. Buried under several shards of ice, Sunny brushed the ice away and picked the object up, then stood up before the next wave came. His frown deepened. In his hand was a simple brass button, similar to those that could be found on the countless winter coats issued to soldiers of the 1st Evacuation Army as part of their kit by itself. The button was nothing special, however. However, Verne and the soldiers under his command weren't part of the 1st Evacuation Army. They were locals of Antarctica and had served at Low 49 long before the Chain of Nightmares. As such, their uniforms were slightly different. In fact, they were of a far better quality, considering that the 1st Army had been assembled and outfitted in a tremendous hurry. Their kits were far better suited for cold weather, and included well-designed parkas that could keep a person warm in most dire of circumstances, instead of cheap mass-produced coats. So how did this button end up here? Sunny stared at the round piece of brass for a few minutes, and then slowly looked up, facing the darkness of the ocean. There was a strangely resigned expression on his pale face. With a sigh, he closed his eyes and extended his shadow sense forward, as far as it could go.
Fine, come on, show yourself, bastard. I know you didn't leave.
His senses spread forward, diving deep under the black surface of the cold water. Everywhere light reached, there were shadows, after all, and even where light never entered, there was its absence. However, Sunny didn't sense the terror no matter how hard he tried. He did find something, though. 20 or 30 meters away from him, deep underwater, there was a large shape. It rested on the seabed, moving slightly from time to time as the currents pulled it back and forth. The shape was irregular and mostly flat, with a very slight curve. Its edges were sharp and jagged. That was all Sunny could say from sensing its shadow. That and the fact that the shape wasn't that of a living thing, considering that the shadow lacked the quality of being cast by something possessing a soul. He had no idea what it was. The ocean contained all kinds of junk, so why would he care? But for some reason, he did, opening his eyes. Sunny looked at the undulating waves for a bit, then he slowly took a step forward, and then another, and then another. The cold, freezing water reached his shins first, then his knees, then his waist. He shivered, gasped for breath, but continued walking forward.
I am not mesmerized, am I?
No, he couldn't be. He had broken the hex. His mind was his own. When the water reached his chest, Sunny took a deep breath and dove down into the black depths. Swimming in a suit of steel armor wasn't an easy task, even one as thin and light as the undying chain. However, he possessed strength and endurance that far surpassed a mundane human. So Sunny persisted, plunging deeper and deeper into the ocean, despite the memory of ice hanging from a string on his neck. A cold like he had never experienced enveloped his body, making it hard for him to breathe, think, and move his limbs, gritting his teeth. Sunny ignored it and swam toward the distant shape. After what felt like an eternity, he finally reached the seabed and pushed himself along its uneven surface, getting closer and closer to his target. Far away on the shore, Saint emerged from the shadow of the wall and approached the edge of the waves, raising her bow. If anything happened, she would be able to send an arrow flying instantly. That made Sunny feel a little better, even though he didn't know how powerful the arrow would remain after piercing tens of meters of water. Considering the strength of Morgan's warbow, it should still be deadly, but the efficacy of the arrow, of course, would depend on the power of the potential enemy. Sunny muttered to himself.
Don't think about that yet.
Concentrating on his task, Sunny moved forward, reached the strange shape and opened his eyes. He observed it through the mass of murky water. The shape was a piece of torn alloy. It was around 10 meters in length and slightly less in width. The tough material was viciously bent and broken, with jagged edges and deep cracks crawling through its surface. It seemed to have been torn away from a larger hole by something large and incredibly powerful. However, there was no rust on the damaged metal, suggesting that it hadn't spent a lot of time in the water. Sunny got closer, feeling as if he recognized the composition and characteristics of the alloy. His mind raced, trying to confirm that familiarity. He placed one hand on the cold metal, remembering, then his eyes narrowed, and a few bubbles of air escaped from his mouth. Of course, He knew where this strong and thick alloy was used. The same type of metal comprised the inner layers of a naval vessel's reinforced armor, the deformed mass of twisted alloy. It was a broken piece of a battleship's hull. Gasping for breath, Sunny rolled out of the shadows and fell on the wet rocks at the edge of the rolling waves. Streams of water flowed from his armor, and his whole body was trembling.
Cold, RS so cold.
Gritting his teeth, he stood up and shivered as the wind assaulted him. At that moment, not even his ascended constitution and the memory of ice could protect him from being chilled to the bone. But even then, the claws grasping his heart were much colder. He cursed under his breath.
Curse it.
Sunny took a step forward, stumbled, then righted himself and stopped. His fists were clenched.
Ariadne, it must have been the Ariadne.
The broken piece of the hull, the brass button, it all made too much terrible sense, of course. This evidence alone wasn't enough to make a definite conclusion, but Sunny was sure of it. His intuition told him that much. No one was coming to rescue the people trapped inside Low 49, and the terror was going to descend upon them soon, without a doubt. Suddenly forlorn, Sunny glanced at the wall of the fortress with a lost look on his face. A few moments passed, accompanied by the howling of the wind. Then he looked down, closed his eyes, and groaned.
I am so tired.
It was the cold that made him shrug off this moment of indecisiveness and start to move. No matter the situation, he had to get somewhere warm first. One step, and he was on top of the wall. A second step, and he was standing on one of the streets of the settlement. A third step, and he suddenly appeared in the corner of a research laboratory where a group of scientists, including Professor Obel and Bate, were staying under guard. The young woman was the first to notice him. She was slightly startled by the sight.
Ascended Sunless, what are you doing here?
Sunny looked at her and forced out a pale smile.
Don't mind me, I just got cold outside.
He stared at Bate with a strangely heavy expression for a few moments, and then shook his head.
In any case, I'll be going now.
Sunny had to see Verne first. He dried himself off, then went back to the security center, feeling the urgent sense of alarm growing louder and louder in his head. Before, Sunny hadn't known its source, and thought that he had days to discover it, but now he wasn't so sure. Maybe there were only hours left before the disaster his intuition was warning him about would happen. Maybe even minutes. Sunny glared at Verne as the seconds ticked away, tick-tock, with each second. Their fates were coming closer to being sealed, and yet, the tall master was being difficult. Sunny snapped.
You are not listening.
I am listening.
Sunny suppressed the desire to hit the table with his fist. Not only would the table shatter and create a lot of noise, but it would also not help his argument in any way. More than that, he was too tired and had no energy to go around breaking furniture.
Then why the hell are you not doing anything?
Verne sighed and asked.
What am I supposed to do?
Sunny blinked.
Gather everyone, load them into the transports, and drive away from this cursed place. What else?
Verne looked at him for a while, his frown growing deeper.
With all due respect, Sunless, you aren't making a lot of sense. You are trying to convince me that the Ariadne isn't coming, but your only piece of evidence is a button and a piece of metal that you found underwater. We both know how much junk and old wreckage was left in the oceans after the dark times. That armor fragment could have come from anywhere, rust or no rust.
Sunny wanted to answer in anger, but managed to hold himself back. Verne wasn't wrong to doubt his rather unsubstantiated theory. Any good leader would question the validity of such information. The problem was that Verne didn't have the benefit of being intimately connected to the strings of fate, like Sunny was. He didn't have Sunny's intuition. He was blind to fate.
Listen, this is what my gut is telling me. Staying here would be a terrible mistake.
Nevertheless, Verne remained unmoved. He lingered for a few moments and then shook his head. His next words sounded polite, but had a sense of weight to them.
I can't gamble with the lives of 1,400 people because of your gut, Sunless.
Sunny let out a frustrated sigh and cursed the damned fool under his breath. Verne was an experienced government officer. From their brief but intense partnership, it had become clear that he was reserved, methodical, and did things by the book. He had received orders from Army Command to reinforce Low 49 and wait for the naval rescue. And that was what he was determined to do. Breaking an order wasn't an easy thing for him. His mind wasn't flexible enough.
You've to admit that I at least might be right, so staying is also a gamble. We are outside the parameters of standard procedure. Verne, can't you think for yourself for once?
Although that last statement was a bit rude, Verne didn't react much. He just stared at Sunny with his usual serious expression, then turned away and sighed. A few moments later, he said quietly,
It doesn't matter anyway.
Sunny scowled. The words caught him by surprise. He muttered, "What the hell does he mean?" What? The older master looked down.
Sunless, we are cut off from Army Command. The situation in the north is bad. We don't know how bad, but it has to be dire for so many nightmare creatures to travel freely through the mountains. The last thing we heard was that several titans had emerged. We don't even know if any of the siege capitals still stand.
As he spoke, his tired face grew darker and darker.
The terrain between here and the last known encampment of the first evacuation army is a maze, with countless swarms of abominations prowling in the dark. Our tech is barely working, if at all. Our soldiers are all exhausted or on the verge of collapse. What I'm trying to say is that a convoy transporting hundreds of civilian non-combatants won't survive the journey, not with what we have left to protect it.
Verne gritted his teeth.
So, it's not that I refuse to entertain the idea that the Ariadne won't arrive. It's that I can't, because that ship is our only hope.
His words echoed in the empty room of the security center, making Sunny feel even colder. A somber silence settled in the conference room of the security center. Eventually, Verne was the first to break it. Straightening, he looked at Sunny and said in a heavy tone,
The best I can do is ask for volunteers among my awakened to risk falling asleep. Some of them might die, but a few should return with the news from the dream realm. Then we can discuss evacuation by land.
Sunny stared at him without saying anything. His anger was suddenly gone, and instead, all that was left was fatigue, regret, and a vague feeling of dark resentment. He cursed quietly.
Damn it all.
If Verne indeed sent volunteers into the dream realm, even knowing that it would be a one-way trip for some of them, they would return in about 8 hours. Finding out what was happening up north would help Sunny tremendously, but 8 hours was too long. His growing panic was already almost suffocating. He didn't know if they had 8 minutes left, let alone 8 hours. Sunny insisted.
There's no time, you can't.
Verne leaned on the table and closed his eyes for a moment. It was hard to know what was going through his mind, but Sunny somehow knew that he wouldn't be able to convince the stern officer. His heart felt cold.
That feeling, this bitter feeling, I haven't tasted it in a while, I think.
At that moment, Verne suddenly said,
A large convoy won't make it, but a single, robust vehicle probably can.
Sunny frowned, struggling to follow the line of thought, perhaps due to his exhaustion. He asked,
What exactly do you mean?
The older master looked at him and shrugged with strange calmness.
I mean that we don't have to put all our eggs in one basket. Your mission isn't to protect every person in this facility. Sunless, unlike mine, your mission is to rescue one specific, high-value target. Both of us have to carry out our duty to the best of our ability, though, so take Professor Obel, load up your APC, and leave immediately. This way, even if your theory is right, it won't be a total loss for humanity.
There was a lot that had been said, and a lot that had remained unsaid, but there was no need to speak some words aloud. The two masters looked at each other for a few moments. A silent understanding between them, in the end. The corner of Sunny's mouth twitched.
I still think that you are wrong. People don't know what's possible and what's impossible until they try it. Well, that was often the case, at least in my life.
Verne simply nodded.
Then prove me wrong, Sunless. I wish you luck.
Sunny grimaced, lingered for a second or two, and then turned around. A moment later, he was gone from the room. He had nothing more to say and no time to waste. There was no time at all, feeling a frightening sense of urgency. Sunny used Shadow Step to appear directly inside the research center. This time, Bate was even more surprised to see him.
Wait, no way, a Master Sunless. Do you perchance keep frightening me just for fun?
He shook his head, looked around, and then beckoned for the young woman to come closer. What he had to say needed to be kept from other ears. Frowning, Bate left Professor Obel's side and walked over to where he was standing, grabbing her by the shoulder. Sunny unceremoniously dragged the young woman to an adjacent room.
Wad, what the hell do you think you are?
He closed the door and turned around, his sunken, manic eyes making Bate shudder.
Quiet and listen, there has been a change of plans.
With no time to explain everything in detail, Sunny just told her the necessary parts, that the professor was in danger and that he had to be evacuated immediately. That sudden revelation was hard to digest, and there would be a potentially fatal delay if Bate refused to listen immediately. So Sunny constructed his words in a way that played on her deeply ingrained values, loyalty to the old man and the desire to keep him alive. Bate's eyes widened.
But why come to me? Why didn't you just approach the professor?
Professor Obel is a noble man. He would be reluctant to leave his people to save himself. So I need you to persuade him fast. You know him best, after all.
The young woman still didn't understand.
But can't we just take everyone?
Her voice was small. Sunny looked at her somberly, knowing that was something that he couldn't do.
My vehicle can only carry so many people. Now, go and do what I said. Every minute we waste can mean the difference between life and death.
Beth nodded in a daze, then slowly turned around, rearranged her lab coat, and left the room. Sunny looked through the crack of the open door at the scientists surrounding the professor, and then turned around in shame. However, this self-indulgence only lasted a second. He had no time for regret, too, not caring about the expenditure of essence. Sunny traveled through the shadows and soon appeared near the rhino. He could feel 3 shadows inside, while Luster, Kim, and Quentin were standing in front of the APC. Noticing him, they straightened their postures.
Captain, sir, I did as you told.
Sunny glanced at Luster and nodded.
Go and run the startup sequence. I want the rhino to be ready to depart at any second.
The young man's eyes turned into circles, but he swiftly dove into the hatch without asking any questions. Sunny, Kim, and Quentin were left alone in the biting cold, feeling his heart beating wildly. Sunny looked up at the sky. The sky was covered by white haze.
The blizzard is starting again.
At that moment, Quentin cautiously asked,
Captain, I am sorry, but what exactly is happening?
He gave the gallant healer a short glance and announced,
We're leaving.
Both his subordinates seemed startled.
Leaving right now, but why?
Sunny lingered with the answer.
Because we have orders to keep the VIP alive.
That seemed to make them stop asking questions. A minute passed, then another. His bloodstream was full of adrenaline, as though he was in the middle of a battle. Time crawled at a snail's pace, and for some reason, Sunny felt as though he was locked inside a pillory, waiting for the guillotine's blade to come down. He shouted at them to walk faster, damn it. His instincts were screaming that they had to leave Low 49. Now, finally. 2 figures appeared from the milky white haze. Professor Obel was walking stiffly, with a troubled face. Bate was both supporting him and carrying a small bag. The old man stopped near Sunny and looked at him with a solemn expression. He hesitated to speak.
Young man, I hear that y'all be taking us away now.
Sunny nodded.
Professor, get inside, please. Hurry, I'll explain later.
They entered the rhino and closed the hatch, while Bate was looking around with subdued curiosity. Luster sent the heavy vehicle moving. The sentries had already been informed by Verne. so they opened the gate and allowed the irregulars to drive through them. Until the last